Hey guys, tonight we step into a tale so chilling that it might just leave you second-guessing your own reflection. It's a quiet, unassuming night, and as you sit back, you can almost feel the weight of the darkness creeping in, just like it did in the very house we're about to explore. Imagine the kind of silence that feels unnatural, the kind that wraps itself around you, making every creak and rustle seem like something more. You probably won't survive this, or at least not without some sleepless nights. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The house at 112 Ocean Avenue had always seemed ordinary from the outside. It sat quietly, nestled in a neighborhood filled with families and the soft hum of suburban life. Yet there was something about the house, something about its presence that sent chills down the spine of anyone who dared to look too long. It wasn't just the faded paint or the darkened windows, but a palpable sense of history, one that whispered of things unseen, things that only the brave or foolish would ever seek to uncover. George and Kathy Lutz were those brave souls, or perhaps, as time would prove, they were the foolish ones. When they first entered the house, they saw nothing more than a run-of-the-mill, albeit slightly weathered family home, a place to start fresh. They had no reason to suspect that the walls they would soon call home held an unsettling history. But within the very structure of the house, secrets festered. The house had a past, a dark one, and it was not willing to forget. Just a year before the DeFeo family had lived in the same house. They had been a quiet, somewhat dysfunctional family, but nothing out of the ordinary. That was until the fateful night when the eldest son, Ronald DeFeo Jr., in a sudden and violent outburst, slaughtered his entire family in their sleep. 6 bodies lay lifeless, sprawled across the rooms, their faces frozen in terror. Neighbors described the house as having a strange aura, even back then, as though it had absorbed the violence, the horror, and the tragedy that had unfolded within its walls. Yet when the Lutz family moved in, they had no knowledge of the grisly history that had stained the home. They were simply a young couple with 3 children excited for a fresh start after purchasing the house at a price far below market value. The first night they spent in the house was peaceful. The house creaked as old houses do, and the night was quiet, save for the soft wind blowing against the windows. The Lutzes were thrilled with the space, large rooms, high ceilings, and a yard that seemed to stretch on forever. It was everything they had dreamed of. Or so they thought. But as the days passed, small things began to happen. At first, they were minor annoyances. Lights that flickered without explanation, a cold breeze that swept through rooms with no open windows. But soon, the disturbances became more intense. The family's once peaceful refuge began to feel more like a place of confinement. George would feel an inexplicable chill crawl up his spine when he passed certain areas of the house, and Kathy found herself drawn to the basement in ways she couldn't explain. George's sense of unease grew as he spent more time in the house. There was something about the rooms, about the very air, that felt wrong. He couldn't put his finger on it, but something deep inside him told him to leave, to get out before it was too late. But then came the dreams. At night, George would sleep fitfully, only to be awakened by the sensation of being watched. He would wake up in a cold sweat, his heart pounding, but no matter how hard he tried to shake the feeling, it stayed with him. He felt like he was not alone. It wasn't long before the children began experiencing things as well. Their once playful laughter was replaced with screams that echoed through the house, piercing the stillness of the night. The youngest Missy began speaking to an imaginary friend, a friend she called Jody. Jody, according to Missy, was a pig-like creature with glowing red eyes, and it wasn't long before she claimed that Jody was her protector. But Missy wasn't the only one affected. The family dog Harry became terrified of certain rooms, especially the basement. He would cower and whimper, refusing to go near the stairs that led down into the darkened, musty depths. One night, while George was cleaning the kitchen, he noticed something strange. The house was alive, breathing almost with the whispers of its past. He saw a shadow flicker in the corner of his eye. He spun around, but there was nothing there. His heart raced as he realized the feeling of being watched had intensified. He could hear the soft whisper of voices, too faint to distinguish, but unmistakable in their presence. The house had a mind of its own, and it was beginning to reveal itself. It was around this time that George began to change. He had always been a calm, collected man, but now there was a restlessness in him, a sharp edge to his temper. He found himself becoming agitated over the smallest things. He would snap at Kathy often for no reason at all. When he wasn't angry, he was withdrawn, lost in his own thoughts, as though the house was slowly draining him of his will to live. Kathy, too, felt the changes. She was beginning to feel overwhelmed by the atmosphere, by the sense of dread that seemed to hang in the air. One evening, as she sat in the living room with the children, she heard footsteps coming from the attic. At first, she thought it was just the house settling, but the footsteps became louder, more pronounced, as though someone or something was pacing back and forth. She called out, but no answer came. There was no one there. As the days turned into weeks, the disturbances grew more frequent and intense. Strange sounds echoed through the house at all hours of the day and night, scratching at the walls, thumping from above, and what sounded like whispers carried on the wind. The temperature would drop suddenly, as though the air itself had turned cold, and Kathy would feel an icy presence pressing against her chest. She knew something was wrong, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. Something in her refused to let go of the house. The couple's youngest child, Missy, began to show signs of strange behavior. She would often speak to herself in whispers, staring blankly into space. Her relationship with Jody, her imaginary friend, deepened, and Kathy noticed that Missy seemed to be growing more and more withdrawn. It was as if Missy was being drawn into the house, as though the house had claimed her in some way. Kathy tried to reach her, but Missy would just smile mysteriously, as if holding some secret that Kathy couldn't understand. Kathy knew she couldn't wait any longer. She had to get help. Something was happening to her family, and it was only a matter of time before they were all consumed by it. She reached out to Father Mancuso, a priest, who had been called to the house earlier to bless it. He had felt the oppressive atmosphere too, something he couldn't explain, but knew was real. When he arrived again, he entered the house with a sense of dread that he couldn't shake. The priest knew that the house was not just a home, it was a prison, and for the Lutz family, escape seemed impossible. Father Mancuso's presence was barely enough to fill the void of darkness in the house. As soon as he stepped inside, the oppressive weight that had long rested on George and Kathy seemed to tighten even further. The house felt more alive now, more insistent. The air seemed thicker, and each creak of the floorboards, each whisper of the wind outside seemed to mock him. The priest had dealt with his share of dark forces, but nothing had prepared him for what awaited in this house. It wasn't just the horror of the murders that haunted these walls. It was something older, something that lived in the foundation itself. He made his way through the rooms, murmuring prayers under his breath. Each room was colder than the last, the shadows in the corners darker, as if they were watching him. When he entered the basement, a cold gust of air hit him, and for a moment, he thought he could see a shadow shift in the corner, just out of reach. A vague figure, something that felt as if it were waiting for him to look away. But when he turned, there was nothing. The whispers grew louder, filling the air with words he couldn't understand. It was as though the house itself was speaking to him, pleading, calling for something that he could never give. He could feel it then, the malevolent force, as though it were wrapping itself around his soul. He needed to get out, but he knew he couldn't leave until he had done what he came for. The prayer was supposed to cleanse the house, but deep down, he knew that it wasn't enough. This was no ordinary haunting. This was something that had been festering for years, something that no simple ritual could undo. Father Mancuso continued with the blessing, but the house seemed to push back against him as if it were fighting the very words he spoke. It was an eerie, suffocating battle of wills. The cold deepened, and then just as he finished the final prayer, he felt it a sharp pressure on his chest as though the house was trying to crush the air from his lungs. He gasped, stumbling back, his heart racing in his chest. He was suffocating, yet there was no physical reason for it. He turned, looking for an escape, but the door was no longer in sight. Behind him, the house seemed to shift. The walls closed in, and from the corners, a figure slowly emerged. It was not a man or a ghost, but something in between its shape, too distorted, too twisted to make sense of. It loomed in the shadows, its eyes gleaming a sickly red. Father Mancuso fell to his knees, his hands trembling as he whispered another prayer, but the words caught in his throat. The figure's grin grew wider, as if it were savoring his fear. Before he could speak, the figure vanished into thin air, leaving nothing but the silence of the house. The pressure on his chest eased, but his heart continued to pound in his ears. He knew then that it was only a matter of time before the house claimed another victim. It had done so before, and it would do so again. He had failed. The house was too strong, its hold too deep, and no matter how hard he tried, the curse of 112 Ocean Avenue was not something that could be removed so easily. Father Mancuso stumbled from the house, his mind clouded by fear and confusion. He had seen things, felt things that he could not explain. He knew one thing for certain, though the house was alive, and it wasn't finished yet. It was still hungry, and it would continue to torment anyone who dared to set foot inside. Meanwhile, the Lutz family continued to endure the horrors of the house. Kathy, who had initially been so hopeful, now found herself lost in a haze of dread. Her once peaceful home had become a nightmare, a prison of torment that she couldn't escape. George, too, had changed. His temper grew worse, his nights sleepless, as he found himself drawn deeper into the house's sinister grip. The more time they spent there, the more they became shadows of their former selves, their lives slipping away like sand through an hourglass. It wasn't just the house. It was the presence, the dark force that had rooted itself deep within. It fed on fear, on despair, and as the Lutz family's hope dwindled, the house seemed to grow stronger. They were no longer just living in a house. They were living in the clutches of something far worse. The walls of their home began to close in on them, both physically and mentally. Kathy started seeing things that couldn't be real, but felt too vivid to ignore. One evening, she stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, when she saw a figure in the reflection of the window. A man, or something that resembled a man with hollow eyes that seemed to follow her every movement. When she turned to look, there was nothing. But the feeling remained. Something was watching her, waiting. She tried to tell George, but he was too far gone, consumed by his own demons. He would mutter in his sleep, thrashing against invisible forces, and when he woke, he would be covered in sweat, his face contorted in fear. He would tell her that the house was trying to take him, that it had a hold on his mind. But there was nothing she could do. It was too late. One night, as the wind howled outside, Kathy sat alone in the living room, the silence heavy around her. She could hear the creaking of the house, the whispers that had become an almost constant presence. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the whispers grew louder, insistent, until they felt like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. Each word was like a weight pressing down on her chest, suffocating her, and she knew this was it. The house had won. The darkness that surrounded the Lutz family deepened with each passing day. The house, now more of a living entity than a mere structure, seemed to thrive on their despair. It had been feeding on them ever since they had moved in slowly but steadily, stripping away their will to fight, breaking down their resolve. Each day felt heavier, the air more oppressive, as if the house itself was drawing them closer to its core, to its heart of malevolent energy. George, now an entirely different man, had become erratic. He could no longer stand the quiet. It gnawed at him, that silence, like a hunger that could never be satisfied. He found himself wandering the halls in the dead of night, the urge to explore consuming him. He would pace from room to room, his mind unfocused, as if driven by an invisible force. And each time he walked past the mirror in the hallway, he saw his reflection, dark, twisted, gaunt, as though the house was robbing him of his humanity, slowly erasing him from existence. Kathy had started to notice the changes in him. His temper had turned sharper, more unpredictable. She had grown afraid of him, afraid of what he might do in one of his sudden rages. His anger was never directed at her directly, but she could feel the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, like a storm on the verge of breaking. It was as if George were fighting something, but there was no escape. Whatever was in that house had already claimed him, and there was nothing left of the man she once knew. One evening, as the sun set behind the house, Kathy was sitting in the living room with Missy. The child, now eerily silent, had withdrawn even further into herself. She spent hours sitting by the window, staring out into the darkening yard, whispering to her friend, Jody. Kathy had tried to speak to her about Jody to make her understand that her imaginary friend wasn't real, but Missy would just smile cryptically, her wide eyes gleaming in a way that unsettled her mother. It was as though Missy was no longer a child, but something else, something darker. The sound of George's footsteps echoed through the house, making Kathy jump. She turned, expecting to see him, but when she looked toward the door, she saw nothing. The silence that followed felt like a threat, an impending doom. Her heart began to race, and she stood up, her breath shallow. "George!" she called hesitantly, her voice trembling. From behind her, she heard it soft at first, then growing louder, a voice clear and unmistakable. It wasn't George's. It wasn't even human. "Get out." The words were barely a whisper, but they carried weight, heavy, suffocating. She froze, the blood draining from her face. Her eyes darted around the room, but there was no one there. No one except Missy, who was still staring out the window, her gaze fixed on something unseen. Kathy stepped back, heart pounding in her chest, and as she did, the floor beneath her creaked. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, and her breath turned to mist. She could feel the presence, the unmistakable feeling of being watched. Her skin prickled with cold, and she knew she wasn't alone. Slowly, she turned to Missy. The child's expression hadn't changed, but there was something different in her eyes. Something older, more knowing. Missy's lips parted as she spoke, her voice unnervingly calm. "Jody says you need to leave." Kathy felt her knees buckle beneath her. She stumbled backward, her mind racing, but she couldn't break free of the grip of fear that had wrapped itself around her. Whatever was in this house had taken root in her daughter, and it wasn't letting go. As Kathy staggered toward the door, She heard the unmistakable sound of George's footsteps, again this time louder. Closer, the thud of his boots reverberating through the house. She spun around, but it wasn't George standing there. It was something else. Something tall, looming, casting a shadow across the room that seemed too dark, too deep. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its form indistinct, flickering like a shadow in the corner of her eye. Its presence filled the room, suffocating, and Kathy knew without a doubt that it wasn't human. The figure spoke, but not in words. It spoke through the air, through her very thoughts. And she could hear its voice, cold and guttural. "Leave, while you still can." Kathy backed away slowly, her breath coming in shallow gasps, but she couldn't look away from the figure. Her legs felt weak as though they were no longer her own, and she stumbled backward, her head spinning. The figure's eyes gleamed with malice, and she could see it smile, the edges too sharp, too cruel. She turned and fled from the room, her heart racing as she bolted through the hallway. She needed to get out. She needed to get to the children. She found herself stumbling into the living room, where Missy still sat by the window, her gaze fixed on the empty yard. Kathy knelt beside her, her voice barely a whisper. "Missy, we need to leave. Do you understand me?" But Missy only smiled. That same cryptic smile. "Jody says it's too late." The air felt thick with the weight of the words, and Kathy couldn't shake the feeling that they were not her own thoughts, but something else entirely. Something that had been planted in her mind by the house, by the entity that now controlled everything within it. A sudden noise from the kitchen made Kathy jump. It was the unmistakable sound of glass shattering, the sharp crack of something breaking. She turned toward the noise, but before she could react, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming closer. The floorboards creaked under the weight of something heavy, something that was coming for them. Kathy turned back to Missy, her voice trembling with desperation. "Where's George?" But Missy only stared ahead, her lips parted in a soft, almost sad smile. "Jody says you'll never find him." Kathy's heart skipped a beat. The house had taken George. It had already claimed him, and now it was coming for her. The lights flickered and the house seemed to groan in protest. Every shadow felt deeper, darker, and the very walls seemed to close in. Kathy stumbled back, fear choking her breath, as the house began to consume her once again. The house, with its dark heart, was no longer content with simply haunting them. It was pulling them in one by one until there would be no escape. And the whispers continued. "Leave, while you still can." The air grew heavier as Kathy moved further from the living room, her steps unsteady, almost as if the house itself were shifting under her feet, urging her to stay, to give in. She didn't dare glance back at Missy, who was still seated by the window. Her small form, motionless, almost statuesque, as if she had become part of the house itself. Kathy could feel it then, its presence following her, creeping in the walls, pushing the air around her. She rushed to the hallway, her heart thumping so loudly in her chest that she thought it might break through her ribs. The house felt like it was alive, breathing, moving with her, in sync with her panic. Her first instinct was to go to the stairs and rush up to the bedrooms where the children slept. But as she approached the staircase, a sudden chill swept through her, freezing her in place. It was the same cold that had filled the air earlier, that had felt like death itself was closing in. The creak of the stairs beneath her feet echoed unnervingly, and as she looked up toward the landing, she saw it. The same figure from before, standing at the top of the stairs. Its form was nothing but a shadow, a distortion of light and dark, its features hidden behind a veil of darkness. It loomed over her, its presence suffocating its eyes, glowing red, piercing into her soul. Kathy tried to speak, but no words came. Her mouth was dry, her throat tight, as if the very air was being sucked out of her. The figure began to move toward her slowly, each step deliberate, the floor beneath it, creaking with its every movement. A faint whisper, soft as a breath, escaped from the figure's lips. "Leave now!" But Kathy couldn't move. It wasn't just fear that kept her frozen in place. It was something deeper, something the house had planted within her. A binding force that made her feel as if her very will had been taken from her. She tried to turn to flee, but her legs wouldn't obey. Then, as if to confirm her worst fears, the voice came again, louder this time, more forceful. "You belong to us now." And in that moment, Kathy understood. It wasn't just the house. It was the evil that had taken root within it, a force that had bound itself to every piece of wood, every brick, every inch of the property. It had waited for years, feeding on the pain and suffering of those who had lived there before, and now it was feeding on her fear, on her desperation. The figure moved closer, and she could feel its coldness, a sensation that crawled under her skin, wrapping itself around her heart, making it beat faster, harder. It was as if her own blood was turning to ice, her very soul being drained by the presence before her. She wanted to scream, to run, but there was no escaping it. The house had already claimed her. Suddenly, she heard the sound of footsteps coming from behind her. She spun around expecting to see George, but the sight that greeted her was far worse. The stairs were filled with shadows, figures that weren't quite human, their eyes glowing, their forms flickering in and out of focus. They were everywhere, moving, circling, closing in on her. And then she saw him. George. But he wasn't the man she had once known. His eyes were hollow, vacant, and his face was twisted in a grotesque mockery of a smile. He was no longer George. He was something else, something that belonged to the house. "George," Kathy cried out, her voice raw with panic. "George, please, come back to me." But George didn't respond. He merely stood there, a puppet in the hands of something far darker than any of them could comprehend. The shadows around him seemed to pulse with an unnatural rhythm, as if they were feeding off of him, growing stronger, feeding on his very essence. Kathy stepped back, her breath coming in ragged gasps, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from him. The house had taken him completely, and now it was turning its focus on her. One of the figures moved closer, its cold breath washing over her. It reached out its fingers, long and bony, its grip like iron as it touched her arm. The cold spread, instantly numbing her, and she felt the life force draining from her body. "Leave," the figure whispered again, its voice like 1,000 voices all blending together into a single unholy sound. "While you still have the strength." But Kathy could barely move her body, trembling, her thoughts foggy. She tried to push the figure away, but it was no use. She was powerless, trapped within the house's unyielding grip. As her vision began to blur, the walls of the house seemed to warp and bend around her, stretching and shifting in unnatural ways. It was as if the house was changing shape, growing, becoming more than it had ever been before. The air was thick with the smell of decay, of rot, of something ancient and evil. Then, as though in answer to her silent plea for escape, the door to the outside, her only escape, swung open. The night air rushed in, cool and refreshing, but it wasn't enough. The house still had a hold on her, still pulling her back into its dark, suffocating embrace. With all the strength she could muster, Kathy forced herself to move. She stumbled toward the door, her legs shaking beneath her, and just as she reached the threshold, she felt the grip on her arm tighten once again. She fought against it, pushing forward, until finally, with one last desperate effort, she broke free. She tumbled out of the house, gasping for air, her heart pounding in her chest, and the door slammed shut behind her with a deafening boom. But even as she stood outside, the house loomed before her, its windows dark and empty, watching, waiting. And Kathy knew deep down that this would never end. The house had marked her, branded her, and it would follow her wherever she went. Kathy stood outside, her lungs burning as she gulped in the cool night air. The night sky above her seemed to stretch infinitely dark and oppressive, as if the very stars were watching her, waiting for her to make her next move. Her body shook uncontrollably, her heart pounding so loudly she could hear nothing else. She had escaped the house, but for how long? She wasn't sure if she had truly broken free, or if she was simply trapped in the nightmare it had created for her. The door that had slammed behind her still loomed in her mind. She could feel its presence even now, like a weight pressing against her chest, making it difficult to breathe. She glanced toward the windows of the house, dark, empty eyes staring back at her. Even in the silence of the night, she felt it, that sinister gaze following her every movement. The house was never truly empty. It would never let her go. Her hand trembled as she pulled her phone from her pocket, dialing George's number. She had to reach him, had to warn him. She didn't care if she sounded crazy. She needed him to understand that they couldn't stay there anymore. The phone rang and rang, but there was no answer. Her pulse quickened with each passing second. She tried again, her finger pressing down on the screen, more forcefully this time. Still nothing. She stumbled backward, her mind racing. Maybe he was just asleep. Maybe the house had gotten to him even more than she realized. Maybe he was still inside, still trapped by whatever it was that had taken him. She couldn't just stand here. She had to go back in, had to get him out before it was too late. But as her foot moved to step forward, a sudden unmistakable sound froze her in place, the creaking of the door behind her. Slowly, she turned around, her breath hitching in her throat. The door to the house had opened once more, just a crack enough to allow a sliver of light to spill out into the yard. It wasn't the light from inside the house. It was something darker, something colder. The air around the door shimmered as though the very fabric of reality were beginning to warp and bend. Kathy's chest tightened, and she couldn't bring herself to take another step. Her legs felt heavy, as if the house were calling her back, pulling her in, unwilling to let her leave. And then she heard its footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from inside the house. The same unmistakable rhythm of George's movements, but twisted, distorted. It was no longer the sound of him walking. It was the sound of something else, something that had taken his place. Kathy wanted to scream, to run, but her feet wouldn't move. She was paralyzed by fear, by the knowledge that whatever was in that house had already claimed him, and now it was coming for her. Her eyes darted around the yard, but the darkness seemed to close in on her, narrowing her vision. It was as if the world had shrunk, and all that remained was the door, the house itself calling her name in the whispers of the wind. She knew she couldn't go back inside. She knew that if she stepped through that door again, she would never leave. The house wouldn't let her, but she couldn't stay here either. The night felt too still, too silent. Every shadow seemed to stretch unnaturally, bending toward her, hungry for her fear. And in that moment, she realized the truth. There was nowhere to run. The house had already infected everything. The darkness, the evil, it had followed her, and it wasn't going to stop until it had consumed her entirely. Kathy turned and ran, not knowing where she was going, just needing to get away. She didn't care about the cold that bit into her skin or the wetness of the grass beneath her bare feet. She just needed to get as far away from that house as possible. But no matter how fast she ran, no matter how hard she pushed herself, the distance seemed to stretch out further, the house never leaving her sight. She could feel its pull, like an invisible chain, wrapping itself around her body, forcing her back. The whispers had started again, faint at first, then louder, rising to a crescendo. They were calling her, beckoning her back. They were calling her to her doom. She stumbled, falling to her knees, gasping for air as the weight of the house's grip grew stronger. The ground beneath her seemed to shift the earth, trembling in response to the power that radiated from the house. Kathy's vision blurred, and for a moment she wasn't sure if she was still standing outside in the yard or if she had already been pulled back inside. The lines between reality and nightmare had begun to blur. The whispers became a roar in her ears. The voice of the house, the voice of something ancient, something that had lived and breathed in the dark corners of the world, calling her name, promising her that it would never let her go. Kathy knew then that she was trapped. There was no escape. The house had claimed her body and soul, and there was nothing left for her to do but surrender to its grip. And just as she felt the darkness consume her, just as she felt herself being dragged back into the depths of the house, she heard a voice. "Mom!" Her heart skipped a beat. It was Missy's voice, but it was different. There was no warmth in it, no innocence. It was cold, detached. "Mom, come back, Jody is waiting." The world around Kathy seemed to freeze. The whispers stopped. The darkness receded, and for the briefest of moments, she saw Missy standing in the doorway of the house, her eyes glowing a sickly red. And behind her in the shadows, something else was moving. The figure of George, his body twisted and contorted, his face frozen in a grotesque smile. It was too late. The house had won. The air seemed to freeze around Kathy. Her breath caught in her throat as she gazed at the figure standing in the doorway. Missy, her sweet little girl, had changed. The innocence that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something darker, something that pulsed from the very depths of the house. Her eyes, once full of wonder and joy, now glowed with an unnatural red light, as though some malevolent force had claimed her soul. Kathy's heart hammered in her chest, her body trembling with terror. She wanted to run, wanted to escape, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her feet felt as if they were cemented to the ground. The darkness of the night seemed to press in on her, suffocating her, drowning her in its heavy, oppressive weight. She could feel the house closing in again, its walls tightening around her, trapping her in its cruel embrace. "Mom," Missy whispered again, her voice colder, more distant. "Come back. Jody is waiting." The words felt like daggers piercing through Kathy's heart. She had to save her daughter. She had to. But how could she? How could she save Missy from whatever had taken root in her, from the thing that had consumed her mind and spirit? Kathy took a tentative step forward, her breath shaky. She wanted to reach her daughter, to hold her, to pull her away from whatever force had its hold on her. But as she moved closer, she felt the air grow colder. It wasn't just the chill of the night. It was the cold of something ancient, something evil that thrived in the darkness. It was the cold of the house itself, reaching out with invisible hands, trying to pull her back inside. Her eyes flicked to the figure standing behind Missy, and she saw it. The shape of George, his body twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. His face was a mask of horror, frozen in a grotesque grin, his eyes vacant, as if he were already dead. And yet there he stood, his form flickering in and out of the shadows, as though he were a ghost, a puppet controlled by the house. Kathy's knees buckled and she fell to the ground, gasping for breath. This wasn't her husband anymore. This wasn't her family. They were no longer the people she had loved, the people she had fought for. They were something else. Something that the house had created, something that the darkness had shaped. The house had claimed them, and now it was coming for her. Missy's voice echoed in her ears, growing louder with each passing moment, a chant, a demand. "Come back! Come back!" Kathy felt the pull, the force drawing her toward the house, toward the figures that now stood like sentinels in the doorway. She could hear the whispers, the voices of the dead, the lost, all speaking to her in a language she couldn't understand. It was as if the house were speaking through them, using their voices to call her back to its depths. She looked up at Missy once more, her eyes full of fear and desperation. "Missy, please, listen to me. I'm your mother. You have to fight. You have to come back to me." But Missy just smiled. It wasn't a smile of love, of innocence. It was a twisted grin, the kind that didn't belong on a child's face. And then, with a soft giggle, she stepped back into the house, disappearing into the shadows. Kathy's heart twisted in agony. The house had already taken her daughter, her family. The force that lurked within its walls had consumed them all. It was the house that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to claim its victims. And now it had claimed them all. Kathy struggled to her feet, her legs weak, her body trembling from the fear that had settled deep within her. She knew she couldn't stay here. She couldn't let the house take her too. She had to get out. But as she turned toward the street, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. She froze. It wasn't the sound of her own steps. It wasn't the sound of the wind or the rustling of leaves. It was the unmistakable sound of someone or something following her. Slowly, deliberately, she turned, her heart racing, but there was nothing. Just the empty darkness of the yard, the house looming in the distance, watching her every move. The footsteps continued, closer now, growing louder, step by step. Kathy's mind raced. What was following her? The figure of George. The twisted reflection of her daughter. Or was it something worse? Something that the house had created just for her. The darkness felt like it was closing in on her, suffocating her. The shadows stretched long and thin, reaching toward her, pulling at her with invisible fingers. She could feel the weight of it, the house's presence, its pull. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was everything. The land, the trees, the very air. It was all part of it, all connected to the evil that had taken root here. Kathy ran. She didn't know where she was going, didn't know if it would make any difference. She just had to get away from it. She had to escape the grip of the house of the evil that had claimed her family. But the footsteps followed, closer, faster. She could feel them now behind her. Something was gaining on her. Something was almost there. With a final burst of energy, Kathy pushed herself forward, her legs burning with the effort. She looked ahead toward the distant lights of the town, but they seemed so far away. The shadows seemed to stretch on forever, and she was trapped, caught in the web of the house's darkness. The last thing she saw was the figure of George, his twisted smile, his empty eyes reaching out for her. And then there was only darkness. Kathy awoke with a jolt, her heart pounding in her chest, as if it had been running alongside her through the night. She gasped for breath, the air heavy and thick in her lungs. But there was no escaping the suffocating presence that surrounded her. Her vision was blurred, the world spinning in dizzying circles. She couldn't remember how she had gotten here, but she knew one thing: she was still inside. The house. She could feel it even now. Its presence hung in the air like a dark cloud, watching, waiting, ever patient. Kathy sat up slowly, her body sore and aching as though she had been asleep for far too long. Her fingers brushed against the cold, damp floor beneath her, and the chill of it sank deep into her bones. It wasn't the comforting cool of a house at night. No, this was different. This was unnatural. She turned her head slowly, taking in her surroundings. She was in what looked like the living room, though it seemed different. The walls were discolored, the wallpaper peeling and stained with something that looked like old dark blood. The furniture was overturned, the remnants of a life once lived, now scattered across the floor, covered in dust and decay. The windows were boarded up, and the faint, distant light filtering through the cracks in the wood did nothing to relieve the weight of the darkness pressing in on her. Her pulse quickened as the realization hit her. The house had brought her back. She was trapped. She tried to stand, but her legs wobbled beneath her, betraying her. A wave of dizziness washed over her, and she staggered to the side, reaching out to steady herself against a broken table. Her hand brushed against the smooth surface of a glass that had been shattered, the jagged pieces pressing against her palm as if they were beckoning her to bleed. She pulled away sharply, clutching her hand to her chest, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. She had to get out, but the house wouldn't let her. The shadows in the corners seemed to shift and stretch, alive and watching. The house was alive. It had always been alive, and it wasn't done with her yet. She could feel its eyes, its countless unseen eyes, following her every movement. She could hear the whispers again, the same low guttural murmurs that had tormented her before. They seemed to be coming from all around her, from the very walls, from beneath the floorboards, from the shadows themselves. She swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath. "I need to get out," she muttered under her breath, her voice shaking. "I need to find the children." But as she looked around the room, the silence grew deeper, heavier. She could no longer hear Missy's voice, nor the distant steps of George. It was as if they had vanished entirely, swallowed up by the darkness that clung to every inch of the house. She closed her eyes for a moment, the fatigue and fear threatening to overwhelm her. When she opened them again, the atmosphere had shifted, the air turning colder, more oppressive. The shadows had grown longer, stretching unnaturally across the walls, their edges fraying like the tattered remnants of a nightmare. Kathy could hear the soft sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, coming from the corners of the room. The air thickened, the walls groaned in response, and then, just as the weight became unbearable, a figure emerged from the shadows. It wasn't George, it wasn't Missy, it was something else. Something that had been waiting for her, lurking in the corners of her mind, in the corners of the house. The figure was tall, its body an indistinct blur of darkness, its edges too sharp, too twisted to be human. The only feature that stood out were the eyes, cold, glowing red, like two smoldering embers, burning with malice. Kathy's breath caught in her throat as it stepped closer, its feet making no sound on the floor. It moved with the fluid grace of a predator, its form flickering, warping like a shadow, and for a moment, Kathy wondered if it was real. But then, as it reached out toward her, she felt the unmistakable presence of its cold, clammy hand brushing against her skin. Her body tensed as the figure leaned in, its voice low and rasping, a cold whisper that felt like it had come from the depths of her nightmares. "You cannot escape." Kathy felt her chest tighten, as though the house itself was pressing against her lungs, constricting her, squeezing the life out of her. She tried to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice caught in a knot of terror. Her head spun the world, tilting at a dizzying angle. But even as the shadows reached out to engulf her, there was a flicker of light, a brief moment of clarity. Through the haze of fear and confusion, she remembered something. She remembered the door. The front door. It was still open. For a brief second, Kathy considered running again, throwing herself through that door into the night. Maybe that would be enough to escape the house, to leave the darkness behind. Maybe, but the figure didn't give her a choice. Before she could move, it was there, its cold fingers gripping her arm, pulling her back toward the center of the room. Her feet dragged across the floor, the shards of broken glass crunching beneath her weight. She fought against it, but the figure's strength was overwhelming, like a vice clamping around her, drawing her back into the heart of the house. "Leave," the figure whispered. "You cannot leave. Not yet." The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a cacophony of voices, all of them speaking at once, all of them demanding something from her. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was the darkness that had infested her very soul, feeding on her fear, on her dread. It had taken her family. It had taken everything from her, and now it was taking her. She screamed a sound of pure terror, but it was swallowed up by the house. The walls seemed to close in on her, the darkness stretching to swallow her whole. And then just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The air grew still. The shadows retreated. The figure was gone. Kathy collapsed to the floor, her heart racing, her body racked with exhaustion and fear. She had no idea how much time had passed. Seconds, minutes, hours. But one thing was clear: the house had won. It always would. Kathy's eyes fluttered open again, though it felt as though she had just woken from a deep, restless sleep. The air around her was suffocating the room, impossibly quiet. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she slowly pushed herself up from the cold floor, feeling every ache in her body. Her legs were weak and her arms shook with exhaustion. She could barely keep her balance as she stood still, disoriented, her mind reeling from the nightmare she had just lived through. But this wasn't a dream. It couldn't be. Her eyes darted around the room, and though it appeared much like it had before, dim, decayed, and silent, there was something different. The house had changed, warped in subtle ways. The shadows seemed darker, more oppressive, and there was an unnatural stillness to the air, as if the house were holding its breath, waiting for her to make her next move. She felt it again, the weight, the presence. It was always there, lingering just beyond her perception, like a hand resting lightly on her shoulder, never leaving. The house had become a part of her, woven into her very being. No matter where she went, no matter how far she ran, it would follow. The feeling of being watched grew stronger with each passing second. The silence was maddening, yet it wasn't the kind of silence that offers peace. It was the kind of silence that suffocates you, wraps you in its cold embrace, and makes you question everything you think you know. Her chest tightened and her breath quickened. The house wasn't done with her. It was far from it. Kathy's eyes moved toward the dark hallway, where shadows seemed to shift, stretching long and unnaturally across the walls. For a moment, she thought she saw something, a flicker of movement, just at the edge of her vision. She turned her head quickly, but there was nothing there. Just the empty, yawning darkness. Her legs trembled as she moved toward the hallway. She had to find her children. She had to find a way out, even though she knew in her heart that escape might be impossible. The house had claimed everything from her. It had already taken her family, twisted them into something they weren't. And yet Kathy couldn't give up. Not yet. The soft creak of the floorboards beneath her feet broke the silence. Kathy froze, her body stiff with fear. That sound. It wasn't just the house settling. No. It was a deliberate sound, one that echoed through the empty halls with purpose. She wasn't alone. She turned slowly, heart hammering in her chest, and that's when she saw it. At the end of the hall, just beyond the shadowy threshold, stood a figure. It was tall and thin, its form flickering like a dying candle's flame, shifting and distorting. At first, Kathy thought it might be George, or something that resembled him. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized it was not George. It wasn't human at all. The figure had no face, no distinct features, just a vague silhouette that seemed to pulse with a kind of unnatural energy. The shadows around it seemed to writhe, feeding on the figure itself, wrapping around it like a cloak. The air grew colder as it moved closer, and Kathy felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over her. a sense that she had reached the point of no return. "Come," the figure whispered, though the sound wasn't from a mouth. It was more like the air itself speaking, the very walls of the house vibrating with its voice. The words seemed to carry weight, pulling her toward it, a gravitational force that Kathy couldn't resist. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but she couldn't. Her legs were frozen in place, as though the house itself was holding her back, keeping her tethered. The figure continued to move toward her, its shape warping with each step as though it were being drawn from the depths of the house itself. The darkness seemed to follow it, curling around it like a living thing. The cold air intensified, and Kathy could feel it in her bones. It was as though the figure was drawing the very warmth from her body, feeding on her fear, her exhaustion. "Come." It repeated, its voice thick and unnatural, vibrating through her skull. Kathy's body trembled violently, but she couldn't look away. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her body betrayed her. The figure reached out, not with hands, but with darkness itself. The shadows around it stretched toward her like fingers, and the moment they touched her skin, it felt like her very soul was being pulled from her body. The overwhelming cold seeped into her veins, and for a moment she saw visions flashing before her eyes. Faces twisted and contorted, their eyes empty, staring at her with pleading, terrified expressions. The house had consumed them all, she realized. It had taken them, twisted them into something unrecognizable, and now it was taking her too. She let out a strangled cry, her hands shaking, as she tried to pull herself free from the figure's grasp, but it was too late. The shadows pulled tighter, the air colder, and Kathy's vision darkened. She felt herself slipping away, the world around her becoming a blur, and just as she felt herself being swallowed by the darkness, the figure stopped. For a moment, everything went silent. The shadows pulled back, releasing their hold on her, and the cold disappeared. She blinked, trying to regain her bearings, but the figure was still there, still watching, waiting. The moment stretched into eternity, and Kathy's heart began to race. The figure's gaze was unyielding, its presence suffocating. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. The house had her, and it wasn't letting go. Then, just as quickly as it had come, the figure stepped back into the shadows, its form dissolving into the darkness from which it had emerged. The cold, the silence, and the weight in the air remained, but the figure was gone. Kathy stood alone in the hall, her body trembling, her mind reeling from what she had just witnessed. She could hear nothing but her own frantic breath and the oppressive silence of the house surrounding her. The house wasn't done with her. It never would be. Kathy knew that now. The house had been here long before her and would remain long after she was gone. It was an ancient thing, a thing born of darkness and despair, and it would continue to claim its victims one by one until there was nothing left. She had been marked, and there would be no escape. Kathy stood in the hallway, unable to move, as the silence of the house pressed against her like a physical force. The oppressive cold which had gripped her the moment the figure had appeared began to ebb, but the sense of dread lingered. It was as if the house itself were breathing each pulse of air, carrying the weight of countless forgotten souls trapped within its walls. She could almost hear their whispers now, faint and mournful, as though they were trying to reach her from the depths of the house's heart. Her heart continued to pound in her chest, each beat deafening in her ears. She could still feel the icy fingers of the figure, a memory that burned through her skin. The house had not just marked her, it had claimed her. She knew that now, deep down. There was no going back. There never had been, but she wasn't ready to surrender just yet. Something inside her, some flicker of defiance of hope, urged her to move, to fight, to survive. But where could she go? The house had already taken everything: her family, her peace of mind, her will to live. She could feel its grip tightening with every passing second, suffocating her, drawing her back into its insatiable maw. Kathy's eyes darted down the hallway, searching for an escape, a way out. But the longer she looked, the more she realized there was no way out. The house had no doors, no windows, no light. It was a labyrinth of darkness, a prison from which there was no escape. The house seemed to shift as she stood there, its walls warping and bending. The corners of the hallway stretched further, the space narrowing until she felt as if she were trapped in a long tunnel with no end. The shadows once familiar now seemed to twist and churn alive with a malevolent energy. The walls seemed to pulsate, thumping with the rhythm of some ancient, unseen heart, and Kathy could hear it, soft at first, but growing louder like a drumbeat calling her back. "Come back," the voice whispered again, as though it were coming from the very walls. "You belong here now." Kathy's blood ran cold. She tried to scream, but the words caught in her throat. The weight of the house's grip on her intensified, like the hand of a giant pressing down on her chest, making it impossible to breathe. She could feel the cold wrapping around her, tightening, and she knew she couldn't take much more of it. But then a sudden clarity pierced through the haze of fear, like a flicker of light breaking through a storm. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. She felt it before she saw it, a change in the air, a shift in the atmosphere. A soft, familiar voice. "Mom." It was Missy. The voice was unmistakable. But it wasn't the voice of the daughter she had left behind in the house. It was something different, something colder. Yet Kathy couldn't ignore it. She could hear her daughter's voice calling to her from the darkness, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she could still save her, still reach her. Kathy's legs moved on their own, the instinct to go to her daughter stronger than any fear. She stumbled forward, her hands reaching out toward the voice. The house seemed to resist her, the shadows growing thicker around her, but she pushed through each step, a struggle against the pull of the darkness. "Missy," she called, her voice trembling. "Where are you?" Her footsteps echoed in the empty hall, each sound a reminder of how alone she truly was. And yet, the voice of her daughter called to her again, this time, closer, clearer. "Mom, come to me," Missy's voice whispered. "I'm waiting for you." Kathy's heart clenched in her chest. She followed the voice, desperate to reach her daughter, to bring her back from whatever evil had claimed her. As she rounded the corner, she saw a faint glow ahead. It was soft, almost like the light of a distant candle flickering in the dark. Her pulse quickened. She knew that light. It was coming from the living room. Kathy pushed forward, her body trembling with the effort. The hallway stretched before her, but she could see the end now, the doorway to the living room. Her heart surged with hope. She was so close. She could feel it, and then just as she reached the threshold, she stopped. The living room was empty. The walls, once familiar, now stood tall and unyielding, like dark sentinels surrounding her. The air was thick with the same oppressive weight, but there was no sign of Missy, no sign of George, no sign of anything but the void. "Mom!" The voice came again, but it wasn't from the room. It was behind her. A soft, sickening whisper. Kathy turned sharply, her eyes scanning the room, and then she saw it. At the far end of the room, barely visible in the darkness, stood a figure. It was Missy, but not the Missy she knew. The child who had been her world, her reason for living, had changed. Her body was unnaturally thin, her face gaunt, and her eyes, they glowed with that same eerie red light. "Missy," Kathy whispered, her voice trembling with fear and disbelief. "What have they done to you?" Missy smiled, but it wasn't a smile of love or innocence. It was cold, predatory, and it made Kathy's blood run cold. "Jody says it's too late, Mom. You belong here now." Kathy's heart sank. The house had taken her daughter just as it had taken George. and now it was taking her too. It was twisting her into something else, something unrecognizable. The shadows closed in around Kathy, pressing in on her, suffocating her with the weight of everything she had lost. She had come so far, fought so hard, but it was all for nothing. The house had won. It had taken her family, her hope, and now it would take her too. Kathy's knees buckled, and she collapsed to the floor, her vision blurring as she tried to breathe. The darkness closed in, pulling her into its depths, and she knew in that moment that there was no escape. The house had claimed them all. Kathy's world seemed to slip away as the darkness of the house consumed her. The weight of it was unbearable, pulling her deeper into its suffocating embrace, drawing her away from everything that had once been real. She could feel the coldness of the floor beneath her, the dampness seeping through her clothes as she collapsed to her knees. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the air thick and heavy, as if the very atmosphere around her was pressing in, trying to crush her. The house had swallowed her whole. There was no light here, no warmth, only shadows stretching endlessly, coiling around her like serpents. Her mind was swirling, the edges of her thoughts fraying as she tried to make sense of it all. But there was nothing to make sense of. This wasn't a nightmare that she could wake up from. It was real. The house was alive, and it had consumed her family. And now it was turning its cold, unrelenting eyes on her. "Mom?" Missy's voice echoed again, distant, yet so close, coming from the shadows that seemed to envelop every corner of the room. It was too late. She could feel it in her bones. The house had already claimed them all. George, Missy. They were all gone. And now it was her turn. But as she knelt on the cold floor, struggling to breathe, something changed. The oppressive weight that had suffocated her began to lift just slightly. A small, almost imperceptible shift in the air. The darkness didn't feel quite as suffocating, the shadows, not quite as consuming. It was as if for a moment the house hesitated, as though it were waiting for her to make a choice. Kathy's heart beat in her chest, slow and heavy. She didn't know how long she had been on the floor, how long she had been trapped in this nightmare, but she knew she couldn't stay here. She had to fight back. She had to save whatever part of herself that hadn't already been consumed by the house. She couldn't let it take her like it had taken the others. With a sudden burst of strength, Kathy pushed herself up, her hands shaking as she braced herself against the floor. Her legs were weak, unsteady beneath her, but she didn't stop. She couldn't stop. The figure of Missy, standing in the corner, watched her silently, its eyes gleaming with that unnerving red glow. "Missy?" Kathy whispered, her voice hoarse, barely audible. "I'm not leaving you here. I'm not leaving you to this." The shadows shifted again, and for the briefest of moments, Kathy thought she saw something. A flicker, a movement in the corner of her vision. A figure, no two figures standing in the distance just beyond the reach of the light. George. It was George, but he was different. His body was bent, his face hollow and twisted, the light in his eyes completely gone. She felt a pang in her chest, a raw ache that felt like it might break her apart. George had been consumed by the house, but she couldn't give up. She couldn't just walk away from him, from Missy. She couldn't let the house win. The whispers grew louder. The voices of the house, the voices of those who had come before her, were calling to her, begging her to join them, to become one with the house. But Kathy wasn't listening. She couldn't. Her mind was focused sharp in its desperation as she forced her legs to move. She stumbled toward the shadows, toward the figures standing at the far end of the room, toward the twisted remnants of her family. She wasn't going to let this place take her. Not yet. Not without a fight. George. Missy. She called, her voice trembling but full of determination. "Come back to me. Please. We can fight this. We can fight it together." But they didn't move. The shadows around them seemed to shift to warp, as if the house itself were holding them in place. The figures that had once been her family were now frozen, trapped within the house, their faces twisted in a permanent, unnatural grimace. Kathy's breath caught in her throat. This wasn't them anymore. She wasn't talking to George and Missy. She was talking to the house. It had taken their souls. It had taken their minds. And now it was trying to take hers. But Kathy wouldn't give in. She couldn't. There was nothing left for her in this house. The family she had known, the people she had loved, were gone. The house had taken them. But it hadn't taken her yet. With every ounce of strength she had left, Kathy pushed herself forward, stepping closer to the figures that resembled her family. The whispers in the air grew louder, sharper, urging her to stop, to turn back, to let the darkness consume her. "Leave the house," seemed to say its voice, 1,000 whispers mingling together. "You belong here." But Kathy's eyes, though clouded with fear, were resolute. She reached out her hand, trembling as she touched the cold air in front of her. She could feel the presence of the house, the malevolent force that had shaped the very walls around her, but she didn't pull back. She didn't stop. The air crackled, the darkness vibrating with power, and for a moment, Kathy thought she had broken through. But then a sudden searing pain shot through her chest, like a needle stabbing into her heart. She gasped, clutching at her chest, her body folding in on itself as the pain intensified. It was the house. It was pushing back. The force inside it was stronger than she had realized, stronger than anything she had fought against before. The darkness clung to her, wrapping itself around her heart, squeezing until it felt like it might crush her. And then, just as quickly as the pain had come, it stopped. The house let go, if only for a moment. But that moment was enough. Kathy's mind cleared for an instant, and in that fleeting moment of clarity, she saw it. A door, a crack, a way out. Her heart skipped a beat. The door was small, barely visible in the corner of the room, but it was there. It was her chance. With what little strength she had left, Kathy rushed toward it, her steps unsteady, but determined. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. The house would try to stop her, but she couldn't let it. She reached the door and threw it open, stepping out into the darkness beyond. And as the door slammed shut behind her, Kathy realized something. The house hadn't truly lost. It had just let her go. For now, Kathy's heart raced as she stepped through the doorway, the sharp cold of the night air rushing over her like a blanket of ice. Her lungs burned as she inhaled deeply, the frigid air filling her chest. But it was a welcome sensation after the suffocating presence of the house. She stumbled forward, her legs weak, barely able to carry her as she fought to keep her balance. Every step felt like a victory, but the echo of the house lingered in her mind, its presence never fully leaving her. For the first time since entering the house, Kathy felt a fleeting sense of freedom, of something resembling hope. She was outside. She was away from it. But as the wind howled through the trees, and the night seemed to stretch on forever, she couldn't shake the feeling that she hadn't truly escaped. The house still called to her, its influence lingering like a shadow stretching across the world beyond its walls. Kathy turned, looking back toward the house. She could see it now, standing tall and ominous against the dark horizon. The lights from the windows glowed faintly like distant stars lost in the blackness. The door she had just passed through was now closed, its surface smooth and unremarkable. But she knew that beyond it, the darkness was still alive. It was waiting. She couldn't shake the images that flashed through her mind, the twisted forms of her family, the hollow eyes of George, the eerie smile of Missy, the the way they had been pulled into the house's grip, their souls devoured by its insatiable hunger. She could still hear their voices, faint echoes calling out from the depths of the house, urging her to return to join them in the darkness. "No," she whispered to herself, shaking her head. "I won't go back." But the wind picked up, carrying with it a strange sound, faint at first, like the rustle of leaves in the distance, and then louder, more distinct. It was the sound of footsteps. Someone or something was walking toward her from the direction of the house. Kathy's breath caught in her throat as her eyes flicked to the silhouette emerging from the darkness. It was a figure barely visible at first, but growing clearer with each step. The figure moved slowly, purposefully, its form familiar, yet wrong. Her heart twisted in her chest as she recognized it. George. But it wasn't the George she had known, the man she had loved. This figure, this thing, was something else. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs too stiff, its face too hollow. The red glow of his eyes reflected the moonlight, and his grin, wide and twisted, looked as though it were carved into his face by some invisible hand. Kathy felt her pulse quicken as she stepped back, her body trembling. The figure was getting closer, moving with the deliberate pace of something that knew it had all the time in the world. The wind whipped around her, and she could feel the temperature dropping, the air turning colder still, as if the house itself were reaching out to claim her again. "George!" Her voice was a mere whisper, cracked and desperate. "Is that you?" The figure stopped just beyond the reach of the fading light, its eyes gleaming with that same unnatural red glow. For a moment, there was silence. Then the figure spoke. Its voice was hollow, empty, like the wind itself. "You shouldn't have left." Kathy's stomach twisted, her heart sinking as the realization hit her. This wasn't George. Not anymore. The house had twisted him just as it had twisted Missy, just as it had twisted everything that had once been familiar. He was nothing more than a shell now, an empty vessel, a puppet of the house. "You belong here now, Kathy," the figure continued, its voice as cold and empty as the house itself. "We all belong here." Kathy shook her head violently, tears welling in her eyes. "No, I won't. I won't stay here. Not with you. Not with this place." But the figure's grin only widened its eyes, growing brighter. It stepped closer, and the air around Kathy seemed to constrict once again, the familiar, suffocating weight returning, squeezing the breath from her lungs. Too late, the figure said, its voice now a low, guttural rasp. "The house has already taken you." Kathy stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. She could feel the ground beneath her feet shifting as though the earth itself were bending and warping, pulling her back toward the house. The shadows that had once seemed so distant now felt like hands reaching out from every corner, grasping for her, dragging her closer to the figure. "No!" She screamed, her voice raw with panic. She forced herself to turn and run, pushing herself through the thickening darkness. Her legs felt weak, her body shaking, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't let the house win. She had already lost too much. She wouldn't lose herself. Her heart was racing as she ran, her feet pounding the earth. But it felt like the ground was giving way beneath her, as though the very land itself were trying to pull her down into its depths. The house loomed behind her, its presence suffocating its gaze, unblinking, watching her every movement. And then, just as Kathy thought she couldn't run any further, she saw it. A light. A distant glow, brighter than the faint moonlight, a beacon in the dark. It was ahead of her beyond the trees. She didn't know if it was real, if it was just another illusion the house had conjured, but she had no choice. She had to reach it. With the last of her strength, she ran toward the light, feeling the darkness close in around her. The figure of George, or whatever it was still behind her, but she refused to look back. She couldn't. She had to focus on the light. She had to get out. As she drew closer, the light seemed to grow brighter, more intense, until it felt as if it were pulling her in. Kathy stumbled forward, her vision blurry, her limbs aching with exhaustion. But she didn't stop, and then just as she reached the light, everything went dark. Kathy's body jerked as she fell into the unknown, her hands reaching out instinctively, searching for something solid, something that would anchor her in the world. She had been running, fighting her way through the suffocating darkness of the house, desperate to escape. But now there was nothing. The light she had seen, the last beacon of hope, was gone, and with it, she had been swallowed by the dark. For a brief moment, she was suspended in nothingness. No sound, no feeling, just the disorienting sensation of falling. It was as though time had stretched out into an endless void, and she was left to float in a place between life and death, between reality and nightmare. Then the ground beneath her feet solidified, and Kathy hit the cold, hard earth with a sharp gasp. Pain shot through her body, but it was different from the suffocating grip of the house. This was real. This was something she could feel, something tangible. She was no longer trapped in the house's dark embrace. She opened her eyes, her vision swimming as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. The air was still cold, but it was fresh. The damp, suffocating atmosphere of the house was gone. She was outside again, standing in a clearing surrounded by trees, their branches swaying in the wind. The distant sound of running water could be heard, and the faint light of the moon flickered through the leaves above her. She stumbled to her feet, disoriented, her body still trembling from the sheer force of her escape. Her heart pounded, but the fear she had been carrying was starting to fade. She wasn't sure where she was, but it felt different. It felt safe, at least for the moment. The oppressive weight of the house, the darkness that had filled every corner of her life for so long, was gone. Kathy closed her eyes, taking a deep breath. She could feel the cold air in her lungs, the weight of it grounding her, reminding her that she was still alive. She wasn't sure how she had gotten here or how she had escaped the house, but she knew one thing: she had made it out. She had survived. But as she took another step forward, she stopped. Something wasn't right. The silence around her was too perfect, too still. She could hear the wind in the trees, the rustling of leaves, the distant trickle of water, but there was no other sound. No birds, no insects, no other living creatures. Just the quiet, empty night. Kathy's stomach churned with unease, and she glanced around her eyes, searching the trees, the darkness, for any sign of movement. But there was nothing. The clearing was empty. She was alone. Or was she? A chill ran down her spine, and she felt it, the presence. It wasn't gone. It was still with her. That terrible, suffocating feeling that had haunted her inside the house, that relentless pull, that unseen force, had followed her out here. She spun around, her heart racing again, but the clearing was still empty. There was nothing behind her but trees and shadows, the moonlight filtering through the branches. But she could feel it. She could feel the eyes upon her. Kathy shook her head, her mind reeling. She was outside. She was free. She had left the house. She had escaped. But had she really? Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, faint sound. It was distant at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, growing closer. A soft thumping, like footsteps in the distance, but too light, too slow, too deliberate. Kathy's breath caught in her throat. The air around her thickened once more, and the familiar feeling of being watched returned. She could feel the presence growing stronger, circling her as though the house was no longer just a building. It had become something more, an entity that had seeped into the world itself, hunting her down no matter where she ran. The sound grew louder still, and Kathy's eyes darted around, her panic rising with every passing second. She couldn't see anyone, couldn't see anything at all, but she knew they were there. She could feel them. The presence was all around her, and then from the shadows of the trees a figure emerged. Kathy froze, her heart skipping a beat. The figure moved slowly, deliberately, its outline obscured by the darkness, but its eyes, those red, glowing eyes, shone through the night like embers in a dying fire. She knew immediately what it was. She didn't have to see its face or its form. She could feel it. It was the house. The figure stepped forward, its form flickering in and out of focus, and Kathy realized with a sinking feeling that it wasn't just a single figure. It was the house itself, alive and breathing, manifesting in this place, this world. The entity had followed her out. It had never truly left. The figure stopped a few feet from her, its eyes locking onto hers, its smile wide and twisted, though its mouth was never visible. There was no warmth in its gaze, no hint of humanity. It was just a presence, an emptiness. You thought you could escape it, whispered its voice, low and hollow, vibrating through the air. Kathy shook her head, her pulse pounding in her ears. She stepped back, her body trembling, but the figure was already moving toward her, closing the distance between them faster than she could run. She could feel the air grow heavier with each step. It took the very ground beneath her feet, pulling her back toward it. No, she gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. No, I left you. I'm free. But the figure didn't stop. Its pace quickened, its form becoming more solid, more real with each passing second. No, Kathy whispered again, her voice breaking. I won't go back. But it was too late. The figure reached out its hand, though not physically, there pressed against her chest. And in that moment, Kathy felt it. The suffocating pull, the darkness seeping into her very soul. She was no longer in control. The house had claimed her again, and it would never let her go. The air around her grew thick, suffocating, as the darkness consumed her once more. And then there was nothing. Kathy gasped awake, her body jerking as though she had been yanked from the deepest part of a nightmare. Her heart was pounding, her chest heaving with each frantic breath. But this wasn't the suffocating darkness of the house. This was something different. She wasn't trapped in its shadow, not anymore. Or so she thought. Her surroundings were unfamiliar, though strangely comforting. She was lying on a soft, warm surface, something like a bed. The air around her was different too. There was a slight breeze carrying the scent of fresh grass and pine. The distant hum of crickets filled the silence of the night, the soft rustle of leaves echoing through the trees. She was outside. She was free. But as she slowly blinked her eyes open, reality hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't free. The house had never left her. The weight of its presence still hung heavy in the air, suffocating her with its darkness. The coldness of it clung to her skin like a second layer of flesh, a reminder of its relentless pursuit. Kathy sat up quickly, her eyes darting around the unfamiliar space. She was outside, yes, but it felt wrong. There was an emptiness in the air, as if the world around her was hollow, waiting for something to fill the void. The light from the moon flickered softly through the trees, casting long shadows that stretched across the ground, and her mind kept flickering back to that same oppressive feeling, the sense that she wasn't alone, that she was being watched. Her eyes snapped to the edge of the clearing, where the trees grew thick, casting deep shadows. For a split second, she thought she saw something move there, a figure fleeting and indistinct, just at the periphery of her vision. She blinked, but it was gone. Her breath quickened. She knew better than to ignore what her instincts were telling her. The house had followed her. It was still with her hiding just beyond the reach of her perception. She could feel its pull, the pressure against her chest growing tighter with each passing moment. The nightmare wasn't over. The house wasn't done. She stood up abruptly, her legs still shaky from the terror she had experienced, but her resolve was stronger now. She couldn't let the house win. She had to keep moving, keep going, even if it meant running forever. But then she heard it, the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the trees, growing louder with each passing second. Kathy's heart skipped a beat as her eyes darted toward the sound. The figure she had glimpsed earlier emerged from the shadows, stepping into the clearing with the same unnerving, deliberate pace. Its form flickered, shifting like a mirage, an entity that could never be fully grasped, always elusive, always just out of reach. It was the same presence, the same malevolent force that had followed her from the house. It wasn't a person. It wasn't a creature. It was the house manifesting before her, stretching its influence across the world outside its walls. Kathy froze, her feet rooted to the ground as the figure approached. It wasn't just walking. It was gliding, moving through the space between the trees, as if it were part of the very shadows themselves, dissolving and reappearing with every step. The figure stopped a few feet from her, its shape now more defined, but still formless, like a black silhouette against the moonlight. She could see the faint gleam of its eyes, red like burning coals, and they were locked onto her with a predatory intensity. "You can never escape it," whispered its voice, slithering through the air like a venomous snake. The words were not from any one mouth. They were the house itself, speaking, its voice woven into the fabric of everything around her. Kathy's breath caught in her throat as the figure stepped closer, its form now towering over her. It didn't speak with its mouth. It spoke through the air, through her mind, its presence suffocating, filling her thoughts with dread. "You belong to me now." The voice continued, wrapping itself around her like a shroud. "You cannot escape. You cannot outrun me." Kathy's vision blurred as the weight of the house's words pressed down on her chest, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, to fight, but no sound came. It was as if her voice had been stolen from her. She was helpless, trapped in this nightmare once again, just like before. Her legs finally gave way beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands trembling as they reached out for something, anything to hold on to. The figure hovered above her, its red eyes boring into her soul, watching her every movement, every breath. "No." Kathy managed to gasp, her voice barely audible through the crushing silence. "I'm not yours. I'm free." The figure didn't respond. It didn't need to. Its presence was its answer. The very air around her thickened, the world closing in, and Kathy could feel it. The house was pulling her back. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the darkness creeping in from all sides. Her mind screamed. She fought against the weight of it, against the force that was dragging her back into the house, back into the abyss. She wouldn't go. She couldn't. But the darkness was too powerful. As she struggled, a strange sensation swept over her. A tingling, almost electric energy that filled the air, surging through her veins. Her mind snapped back to the moment when she had first tried to escape, when she had made the decision to leave the house, to break free. And she remembered something. She remembered the door that had opened for her. The crack of light, the feeling of the outside world beyond. It was still there. She could still find it. With a renewed sense of determination, Kathy forced herself to stand the figure looming behind her, its presence suffocating, its eyes burning into her back. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She had made it once before. She could do it again. She ran. Her legs felt like lead as she bolted through the clearing, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. The wind whipped through her hair, and the sound of footsteps her own, and the figures echoed behind her. She didn't dare look back. The house was still there, pulling at her, trying to reel her in, but she had to keep moving, and then through the trees, she saw it again. The light, the crack, the door. It was there. She could see it shining through the branches. Her body surged with adrenaline as she pushed herself forward, the space between her and the light narrowing. She was almost there. Almost. And then the ground beneath her feet gave way. The figure reached out with shadowed hands, and the darkness swallowed her whole. Kathy's scream was swallowed by the darkness before it could escape her mouth. She fell not to the ground, but into an endless void, the world around her collapsing into a blur of blackness and cold. For a moment, there was nothing but the overwhelming sensation of falling, of being consumed by the very air around her. She could feel herself sinking deeper and deeper into an abyss, each second stretching into eternity. But then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation stopped. Kathy was jerked to a halt, the pressure on her body vanishing as if it had never existed. Her breath caught in her throat as her surroundings slowly came into focus. She was no longer in the clearing, nor was she outside in the fresh air. No, she was back. She was inside the house. Kathy's eyes shot open in horror as the familiar, suffocating weight of the house pressed down on her once again. She was standing in the living room, the same one she had fled from not long ago. The same dark corners, the same oppressive air, the same unsettling silence. Nothing had changed. The house was still here. It had never let her go, but something was different. This time, it was colder, darker. The shadows stretched longer, and the once familiar rooms now seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, as though the walls themselves were alive, breathing with an ancient malevolent force. She stumbled back, her heart hammering in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thicker, heavier, pressing against her lungs. The whispers began again, faint at first, like the rustling of leaves in the distance, but growing louder with every passing second. They were everywhere. They were inside her head, inside the very fabric of the house, and they were calling to her. You shouldn't have left the voice echoed, but it wasn't just one voice. It was a chorus overlapping an endless string of whispers, weaving together, coming from every corner of the room. You can never escape. Kathy's body tensed, her limbs frozen in place as the shadows closed in around her. She could feel them tangible, creeping across the floor, crawling up her legs, wrapping around her body. It was the house. It was calling her back, pulling her in, tightening its grip around her just like before. The more she tried to move, the more it dragged her in. She could feel the weight of it, the years of suffering, the endless torment, all trapped within the walls of this cursed place. "No," Kathy whispered, her voice hoarse and desperate. "Please." Her vision blurred as the shadows around her thickened, becoming more solid, more defined. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The house was overwhelming her, consuming her, its dark influence seeping into her very bones. Her hands trembled, and she pressed them against her chest, trying to steady her racing heart. She wanted to scream, but her voice caught in her throat, strangled by the suffocating presence of the house. "Mom?" The voice stopped her. It wasn't just the house. It wasn't just the whispers. This voice was different. It was Missy's voice, but it wasn't the innocent voice of her daughter. No. It was colder, more distant. And it was calling her, beckoning her to come closer. Missy Kathy whispered, her voice barely audible. She turned toward the sound, her eyes searching the room, desperate for any sign of her daughter. "Missy, please. Where are you?" There, standing in the shadows, was the figure of Missy. But she was no longer the little girl Kathy had known. Her body was thin, her face pale and hollow, and her eyes, those same red, glowing eyes, stared back at Kathy, empty and cold. The smile that spread across her face was twisted unnatural, like something straight out of a nightmare. Missy Kathy choked out her heart breaking at the sight of her daughter. "Please, come back to me. You're not like this. You're mine." Missy interrupted, her voice distant, hollow. "You all are." The words sent a shiver down Kathy's spine, a chill that radiated through her body. The figure of Missy stepped forward, her eyes fixed on Kathy with an intensity that made her want to flee. But her body wouldn't move. She was trapped, frozen in place by the house, by the force that had taken hold of her family. "No." Kathy whimpered, shaking her head in disbelief. "No, you're my daughter. You're not like this. You can fight it. You can still come back." Missy's smile only widened her lips, pulling back in a grotesque mockery of joy. The shadows around her twisted and writhed, as though they were alive, reaching toward Kathy, trying to pull her into their depths. "You don't understand," Missy said softly, her voice echoing around the room. "You can't save me. You can't save anyone. The house has already won." Kathy felt the last remnants of hope slip away, her heart sinking into the pit of her stomach. She had tried. She had fought with every ounce of strength she had left. But it was all for nothing. The house had consumed her family, and it was consuming her now. "Let me go," Kathy whispered, her voice shaking with fear. "Please." But the shadows closed in around her, thick and unyielding, pressing in on every side. She could hear the whispers again, louder this time, more insistent. The house was calling her back. It was pulling her in, drawing her toward it. And then through the thickening darkness, she heard it, another voice, soft and familiar, calling her name. "Mom!" It was George. His voice so clear, so real, like a lifeline thrown to her in the sea of darkness. She turned frantic and saw him standing just beyond the reach of the shadows, his figure dimly lit by the faint glow of the house's malevolent energy. He was alive. He had to be. Kathy's heart surged, her body moving without thought as she reached out toward him. "George," she cried, her voice breaking. "George, I'm here. I'm not leaving you. Please." But just as quickly as he had appeared, George's figure faded into the darkness. The shadows swallowed him whole, and Kathy felt her chest constrict with despair. The house was taking him again. It was taking them all. And there was nothing she could do to stop it. The weight of the house's power was overwhelming. She could feel it crushing her, dragging her down, pulling her back into its depths, where there would be no escape. She had been lost the moment she had set foot inside. And now, the house was claiming her once more. "You belong to me," the voice whispered, louder this time, filling her mind. "You always will." And with that, the darkness consumed her once again, the house closing in around her, swallowing her whole. Kathy's consciousness flickered like a dying ember, pulled between the fading light and an all-consuming darkness. The house wrapped itself around her like a suffocating shroud, the shadows closing in tighter with every second. She could feel its presence, its oppressive weight pulling her deeper into its heart, deeper into its hungry embrace. But even in the crushing darkness, a tiny spark of resistance burned inside her, a last vestige of defiance. She tried to scream, but the sound was muffled, swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence. Her limbs felt heavy, her body unresponsive, as if the house had drained her of every ounce of energy. It was a battle to even think, let alone act. But there was a spark, a glimmer of something, a voice faint but insistent. It wasn't the voice of the house. It wasn't the voices of the lost souls trapped within. It was her own voice. "Not yet," she whispered to herself, her thoughts shaky but firm. "I'm not done. The house seemed to press in, mocking her struggle. The shadows pressed against her skin like cold fingers, dragging her into their depths. But she could still hear the whispers, the voices of the house's torment curling around her like tendrils trying to pull her under. "You are mine." They hissed their voices too many to count, all clamoring for her, trying to drown out her will. But she wouldn't let it. She couldn't. Not again. For a moment, Kathy allowed herself to sink into the silence, to let the house feel like it had won. She gave into it just for a second, feeling her mind slip further into the void. The weight was unbearable, the darkness pressing down on her chest, until the sensation of falling deep into the abyss became too real, too absolute. And then something shifted. It wasn't much, but it was enough. She felt the flicker of something, some remnant of herself still fighting, still clinging to the smallest shred of hope. Her fingers twitched, her legs moved, even if only slightly. The shadows, sensing the change, recoiled just a fraction, pulling away from her for a split second, enough for her to breathe. Her pulse quickened. This was it, the sliver of space she needed. "I'm not yours," Kathy hissed, her voice shaking but growing louder with each word. "I won't be yours." It was a whisper at first, a promise to herself. But as she forced the words out, as she took a breath deep into her lungs, the power behind them grew. With each syllable, the shadows seemed to pull back. The cold, suffocating air around her began to lift, and Kathy's heart swelled with an unfamiliar warmth. It wasn't much, but it was enough to stir the blood in her veins, to remind her of what it was to be human, to be alive. The darkness surrounding her, though still thick and heavy, began to feel just a little less suffocating. The house was no longer pulling her down into its crushing depths. She could feel the edges of the shadows, the edges of her reality shudder, almost like they were losing their grip on her. "I'm not staying," Kathy growled, her voice stronger now, more determined. "I don't belong here. None of us do." With a sudden force, she pulled herself to her feet, her legs trembling but solid. She felt the weight of the house pushing back against her, but this time, it was different. She wasn't just running from it. She was fighting it. She staggered, her hands reaching out for something, anything, to steady herself. Her fingertips brushed against something cold but firm, something that wasn't the oppressive walls of the house. And when she opened her eyes, she saw it. The light. The doorway. It was real this time. The door, no longer just a faint glow in the distance, stood before her. It wasn't just an exit. It was a barrier, a threshold between the nightmare she had been trapped in and the world she had left behind. Kathy's breath caught in her chest, her heart pounding in her ears as she stumbled toward the door, her every step a struggle. The house's influence still pressed down on her like a claw around her throat, but she pushed forward. She had made it before. She could make it again. But just as she reached the threshold, something held her back. The house. The shadows. They surged forward, enveloping her, pulling her into their depths once more, trying to pull her back into the suffocating dark. But Kathy fought, pushing against them, her hands outstretched toward the light. "Let me go!" she screamed, her voice raw, her throat burning with the force of it. The shadows writhed, pulling her closer, but Kathy fought harder. She could feel the presence of the house, the ancient oppressive force that had shaped it, closing in around her. It was its final act of resistance, its last effort to drag her back into the darkness. But Kathy didn't let go. She couldn't. With one last surge of strength, she shoved her body through the darkness, feeling the cool air of the outside world rush over her. The house's grip slipped just for a moment, and it was enough for Kathy to break free. She stepped through the threshold, feeling the weight lift from her chest, the suffocating dark unraveling as the world outside swallowed her whole. The door slammed shut behind her, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Kathy felt free. But even as she collapsed to the ground, her breath ragged her body. Trembling, she knew the truth. The house had let her go, but only for now. She wasn't free, not completely. But as she lay there, looking up at the sky, the moon glowing softly above, she felt the faintest hope stir in her. She had fought. She had escaped. And as long as she was alive, as long as she kept fighting, there would always be a chance. But the house would never stop, and neither would she. Kathy didn't know how much time had passed since she had collapsed on the ground outside the house. The darkness of the night felt almost too quiet, the air thick with an eerie stillness, as though the world itself was holding its breath. Kathy's chest still heaved, her body trembling, but there was a strange calm in her now, something she hadn't felt in ages. She wasn't inside the house anymore. That much was clear. But as she sat up, rubbing the back of her hand against her eyes, the question that loomed over her felt just as oppressive as the house itself. Had she truly escaped? The landscape around her was unfamiliar. It looked like a dense, forested area, with twisted trees and thick underbrush. The moonlight barely pierced the canopy, leaving most of the ground cloaked in darkness. Yet the space felt open, and the air smelled fresher, colder, the scent of pine and wet earth mingling with the breeze. She wanted to believe she was free, really free. But the part of her that had lived through this horror, that had felt the suffocating grip of the house, couldn't quite shake the feeling that it was still there, lurking just beyond the veil. The whispers were still in her mind. Even now, as she tried to calm her breath and get a hold of herself, she could hear them. Low guttural murmurs, like they were sewn into the very fabric of her thoughts. You belong here. You can't escape. The words echoed, fading in and out, growing louder with every passing second. Her heart clenched. She could almost feel it again, the invisible pull, the way it had drawn her in and out of the house. The house, in a twisted sense, was a part of her now. It had marked her. And no matter how far she ran, no matter how many doors she passed through, it would always follow. Kathy stood up slowly, her legs still shaky beneath her. She wasn't sure if she could keep running. The shadows of the forest pressed in around her, and she felt them encroaching on her every step. There was no escape, not truly. She was already trapped in the memory of it, trapped in the nightmare that had consumed her life. Her breath came in ragged bursts as she slowly turned her head to face the house one last time, though she knew what she would see. It was still there, looming in the distance. The towering silhouette of its dark form seemed to stretch across the horizon, stretching its shadow over everything in sight. Its very presence seemed to ripple the air around it. She didn't want to look. She knew it wouldn't make a difference, but she had to, and there it was. The door. The faintest sliver of light breaking through its cracks, beckoning her, calling her back to the nightmare. She felt its gaze. The house was waiting for her, but Kathy couldn't go back, not again. She turned away, her feet carrying her forward, despite the dread that gnawed at her mind. Every step felt like it took all her strength. The shadows in the forest were growing more pronounced, and she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. A strange, oppressive energy filled the air around her. The silence was no longer peaceful. It felt like something was hiding, watching her, waiting. The sounds of her footsteps began to fade as the air thickened. And then out of nowhere came a rustle in the bushes to her left. The sound was so sudden, so sharp that Kathy froze mid-step. Her eyes flicked to the source, but she saw nothing. Just the dark outlines of trees and shadows stretching across the forest floor. She swallowed hard, her heart racing. Hello. Her voice was shaky. but it cut through the silence hanging in the air like a challenge. The forest remained still. No response. Then the rustling came again, louder this time, closer. Kathy's breath caught in her throat. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her feet remained rooted to the ground. The hairs on her arms stood up as she braced herself for what was coming. From the darkness of the trees, something emerged. A figure tall and thin, moving slowly, deliberately toward her. The shadows seemed to gather around it, twisting into unnatural shapes. The air itself seemed to warp, vibrating with something almost electric. For a moment, Kathy thought it was George, but the figure's silhouette didn't quite match his. It was too otherworldly. The figure was a silhouette, sharp and fragmented, as if it had been pulled from the very fabric of the night itself. There were no recognizable features, just darkness, and the faint gleam of red eyes reflecting the faint moonlight. Kathy's pulse quickened. She knew this wasn't George. This was something else, something far worse. She stepped back, her hands trembling, as she reached for something, anything to defend herself with. But there was nothing. Only the harsh, suffocating presence of the figure, its gaze fixated on her, unwavering. "You can't escape the figure," whispered its voice, like the rustling of dry leaves, rasping and cold. Kathy's breath faltered. Her mind raced, her thoughts a blur of panic. How could it have followed her out here? The house. It had followed her. In one swift motion, the figure stepped forward, moving with unnatural speed, and Kathy instinctively turned to run, her legs carrying her forward, despite the growing heaviness in the air. But the figure was too fast. It caught her arm, and she screamed, the sound of it echoing through the trees as she struggled against its grip. It was like cold metal, an iron grip that held her tightly, not allowing her to break free. Kathy's legs buckled beneath her, and she fell to her knees. The figure loomed over her, its red eyes glowing brighter, its form flickering as if it were a shadow itself. It loomed large above her, its hand outstretched. "You belong to the house." It hissed the words, thick with darkness. "You cannot leave." Kathy struggled, her body aching, her breath ragged. The shadow pressed down on her, suffocating her until it felt like she couldn't breathe at all. She was caught in its grasp. The house hadn't let go. And then from the edge of the forest, a voice. "Kathy." It wasn't the figure. It was a real voice. Familiar. It was Missy. Kathy's head snapped toward the sound, a flicker of hope in her chest, even as the darkness pressed tighter around her. "Missy," she whispered. But the shadows seemed to press in, drowning out the voice. The figure released her arm, its grip slowly pulling away. She turned, desperate, to see Missy standing there, her eyes glowing bright red. "Come back, Mom," Missy said, her voice cold and unrecognizable. "Jody's waiting." The figure behind Kathy spoke again, its voice colder than before. "She cannot save you, Kathy. You are ours." Kathy's heart dropped into her stomach as Missy stepped closer, her small frame now a mere shadow of the girl Kathy once knew. Her body was thin, almost gaunt, her face too pale, too still. Her eyes, glowing red in the moonlight, were filled with an unholy emptiness, their warmth and innocence long erased. "Missy," Kathy whispered, her voice trembling with both fear and sorrow. "What has happened to you?" Missy didn't answer. Instead, her lips curled into a smile, one that wasn't hers, but something far darker. It was as though the house had taken her, completely stripped her of the girl Kathy had known, leaving behind an empty vessel, a puppet for its will. The shadows around her seemed to feed off her presence, stretching and contorting as if they were alive, feeding off the dark energy that flowed from Missy's eyes. "Mom, come to me." Missy's voice echoed, but it wasn't just her voice. It was the voice of the house. the house that had claimed them all. "Come back. Jody's waiting. We're waiting for you." Kathy staggered back, her breath coming in short gasps. She could feel the weight of the house closing in on her again. Its presence was suffocating, crawling over her skin like ice. She wanted to run to escape, but the shadows seemed to crawl toward her, gripping her legs, pulling her back, trapping her. The figure that had once been George was still standing just behind her, watching her with those cold, empty eyes. It had not left. It would never leave. The house would never let her go. Kathy's chest tightened as she turned her gaze back to Missy. The small girl was still there, smiling that unnerving smile. But the light in her eyes was gone, replaced by something ancient, something evil. "Missy, please," Kathy whispered, desperation flooding her voice. "I won't leave you like this. I won't let this happen." But Missy simply tilted her head, her smile widening. The figure behind Kathy stepped closer, its red eyes now focused solely on her. The air grew colder, heavier. "You belong to us." The voice of the house hissed, swirling in the air, like 1,000 whispers. "You have always belonged to us." The ground beneath Kathy's feet seemed to shift, as though the very earth were part of the house's grasp, pulling her deeper into its thrall. She could feel it, its hunger, its need to devour her, to consume her entirely. Kathy's knees buckled beneath her, and she collapsed to the ground, her hands pressed against the cold earth. It felt like the house was reaching into her soul, tearing at the very fabric of her being. The shadows crept closer, wrapping around her, suffocating her. But in the depths of that suffocating darkness, Kathy remembered something she had forgotten for so long. She had fought before. She had escaped before. She could do it again. With all the strength she had left, Kathy forced herself to her feet, her arms shaking as she pushed through the oppressive weight of the house's presence. The whispers of the house grew louder, desperate, furious, but she didn't listen. She couldn't. She had to fight. She had to escape. Kathy turned and looked toward the woods, toward the distant horizon. The way out. The light, it was still there, somewhere beyond the shadows, beyond the reach of the house. She ran. Her legs were weak, and her body ached with the weight of the darkness that followed her. But she ran. She forced herself to run, her breath shallow, her heart pounding in her chest. Each step was harder than the last, but she couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. The figure of Missy, her twisted, empty form, and the figure of George still standing in the shadows, both seemed to fade behind her, swallowed by the darkness of the forest. She couldn't look back. If she did, she knew the house would drag her back in. She reached the edge of the forest, her breath ragged, the weight of her fear pushing against her chest. The house, the shadows, the whispers, they were still with her, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She had made it this far. She had to keep going. But as she stepped out of the forest and into the clearing, she stumbled to a halt. In front of her, standing in the middle of the path, was a figure. It was a tall man, his form barely visible in the moonlight, but she could see the outline of him clearly enough. His eyes were wide, staring at her with a deep, unsettling emptiness. Kathy's heart dropped as recognition hit her. It was Ronald DeFeo, the man who had murdered his family in the house before her. The very house that had swallowed her family, her life, her soul. "No?" she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "No, it's not you. You're dead. You." But before she could finish, the figure smiled, and the smile was too wide, too knowing. "We are all dead, Kathy." Her breath caught, and before she could react, the shadows rushed in, overwhelming her with their icy, suffocating presence. She was drowning in them, the darkness closing around her, pulling her deeper, deeper into the house's grasp. And then in the blink of an eye, the house was gone. Kathy blinked, trying to clear her vision. The oppressive weight had lifted. the figure of Defio, the shadows, everything, the nightmare faded into nothingness. She was outside again, standing in the same clearing, the same forest, but everything had changed. The house was no longer looming in the distance. There was no sign of it at all. The moon hung high in the sky, the air crisp, the world still and peaceful. For the briefest of moments, Kathy thought she was free. She thought she had escaped for good. The terror, the whispers, the endless darkness, they were gone. But then she felt it again. The pull, the suffocating pressure. The house was still with her, and the whispers began again, faint at first, then growing louder, a chorus in the back of her mind. The house hadn't just haunted her. It had become her. "You can't escape," it hissed. "You belong to us." Kathy's knees buckled once more, but this time she did not fall. The realization hit Kathy with the weight of an avalanche. She wasn't free. She couldn't escape. Not the house, not its reach, and not the shadows that clung to her very soul. It was as though it had seeped into her very being, crawling beneath her skin, making its presence a permanent fixture in her mind. The whispers grew louder, but this time they weren't coming from the house. No, this time they came from within her. The house had become a part of her, a parasite feeding off her fears, her memories, her every thought. Its influence was pervasive, threading its way through her consciousness until she wasn't sure where she ended and it began. It was a slow suffocation, a constant pressure that made her wonder if she had ever been truly herself. Kathy pressed her hands to her temples, trying to block out the relentless voices. They were there, swirling around her like a swarm of bees. "You belong to us. We never let you go. You are one of us." She fell to her knees, overwhelmed by the suffocating weight of it. It wasn't just the house anymore. It was her. The house had found its way into her mind, her soul, and it wasn't letting go. Every time she thought she had broken free, every time she thought she could escape it, pulled her back into its clutches, reminding her that she was already part of it. Her body trembled as she tried to stand, but her legs felt like lead, as though the house had tied invisible chains to her. She struggled to move her hands, shaking as she gripped the cold earth beneath her. The moonlight above seemed distant, too far away to be a part of the world she now inhabited. The forest around her was silent, but that didn't comfort her. The quiet was suffocating. It was the silence of something waiting, watching, something that had always been there, always watching her from the shadows, waiting for her to break. A chill crept up her spine, and she felt the familiar presence behind her again. The house. Its breath was in the air, its grasp tightening around her, as though it were drawing her back into the very earth beneath her feet. It had already claimed her. Kathy closed her eyes, a tear slipping down her cheek, and for a moment she wanted to give in, to let the house have her completely, to end this nightmare once and for all. But something inside her refused. The flicker of defiance, the desire to survive, burned within her chest. She had come so far, fought so hard. She couldn't let it end here, not like this, not with the house winning. She staggered to her feet, her body trembling from the effort, and took a step forward, then another. Her movements were sluggish, but there was a fire in her chest that she hadn't felt before. She had to get out. She had to keep moving. The house couldn't have her. Not now. Not ever. The world around her blurred as she stumbled through the forest, pushing past the thick brush, trying to ignore the gnawing feeling of the house following her, pursuing her with every step she took. The trees seemed to close in on her, the shadows thickening, as if the forest itself were a living thing trying to pull her back. She could feel its grip, tightening its cold fingers, reaching for her, pulling at her body, her soul. "You can't escape," the whispers came again this time, louder, more insistent. "You will always belong to the house." Kathy's breathing grew shallow, her body aching with exhaustion. Her legs were giving out, her body too weak to continue. She wanted to stop, to collapse, to let the shadows take her, but the thought of the house, of everything it had done to her family, pushed her onward. She couldn't stop. She wouldn't stop. Through the darkened trees, she saw it, the light, the faint glimmer of it in the distance. Her heart surged with hope, but she didn't dare look back. She just ran faster, harder, even though her muscles screamed in protest, even though every part of her begged her to give in. The house had taken so much from her, but it wouldn't take her will. The light grew brighter with each step, and as she drew closer, Kathy realized it wasn't just a light. It was something more, something that felt real, something that felt like escape. Her heartbeat quickened, the sound of it pounding in her ears as she broke through the edge of the trees and into the open clearing. And there it was, the door. It was real this time, standing before her like a portal to something beyond the endless nightmare she had been trapped in. It wasn't a door from the house, it was something else. Something that had been waiting for her. The very door she had glimpsed before, the one that had always been just out of reach. Kathy didn't hesitate. She rushed forward, her hand reaching for the handle, her breath ragged, her chest tightening. But just as her fingers brushed the cool metal of the doorknob, a hand gripped her shoulder, and she was pulled back, her body twisting violently. "No." The voice whispered in her ear, its breath cold against her skin. "You belong here. You always will." Kathy gasped, her mind reeling as the familiar weight of the house's influence pressed against her once more. The door was within reach, but the darkness was right behind her, consuming her, wrapping around her like a vice. The grip on her shoulder tightened, and she twisted in the figure's hold, looking up to find the glowing red eyes of the house's entity, the thing that had chased her, that had followed her here. Her body was paralyzed with fear. The door was so close, but the figure was pulling her back, its grip like iron. "You can't run from me," it hissed, its voice dripping with malice. "You're mine." But Kathy fought. She fought with every last ounce of strength in her body. She couldn't let it end like this. She couldn't. With a desperate cry, she shoved the figure away from her, her body burning with the force of it. And then the door opened. The light behind it flooded the clearing, casting away the shadows, filling her with a warmth and peace she hadn't felt in what felt like an eternity. The house screamed in fury, its presence pushing against her, trying to pull her back into the darkness. But she didn't hesitate. Kathy stepped through the doorway, feeling the warmth of the light flood her body, washing away the house's grip, its suffocating presence. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in so long, she felt free. Kathy stepped through the threshold of the door, and as she did, the world seemed to shift. It was like stepping into a different reality, one where the weight of the house, of its darkness and its endless grip, was suddenly lifted from her shoulders. For the first time in what felt like forever, she felt light, unburdened, and the pressure in her chest, the constant feeling of something suffocating her, disappeared. She took a deep breath, the fresh air filling her lungs, and as she exhaled, the heaviness of the house seemed to dissipate like smoke, vanishing into the wind. The light surrounding her wasn't harsh or overwhelming, but gentle like the first light of dawn. It bathed her in warmth and peace, as though it were cleansing her of the darkness she had been trapped in for so long. For a brief, fragile moment, Kathy felt hope. True, untainted hope. She looked around her, trying to take in the new surroundings, but what she saw stunned her. She wasn't in a forest anymore, nor was she standing in the clearing she had just been in. The landscape was different. It was beautiful. She was standing on a soft, grassy field bathed in golden light. The trees around her were lush and vibrant, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The air was crisp, but not cold, just perfectly refreshing, like the very essence of life itself. The birds chirped in the distance, their songs harmonious, unlike the eerie silence that had filled the house. The gentle rustling of the leaves in the wind was the only sound, and it was peaceful. Kathy blinked, unsure if what she was seeing was real or a dream. Was this really freedom? Was this the escape she had longed for? Or had she merely found another nightmare that the house had constructed to lure her back? She moved forward cautiously, her body still feeling weak from the relentless assault of the house. She needed to know if this place was real. She needed to know if this was truly freedom. As she stepped forward, she noticed something odd. There were no footprints behind her, no sign that she had just walked through the field. The grass beneath her feet seemed untouched, undisturbed. It was as though she had always been here, as though this place had been waiting for her for the moment she would finally step away from the house's grasp. She stopped standing in the middle of the field and looked around. The horizon stretched out in front of her, the sky painted with soft hues of twilight, the sun's final rays casting a golden glow over everything. The world felt so alive here, so real, but something nagged at her, a quiet whisper in the back of her mind. It was familiar. Too familiar. Suddenly she heard it. A soft, faint sound at first, like a whisper carried on the wind, but it grew louder as she stood still, her breath catching in her throat. Her name, Kathy. The voice was distant, yet somehow all around her, reverberating through the very air. It was a voice she recognized all too well. It was her own voice. But something was wrong. It wasn't the voice of the woman she had become. It was the voice of someone else. Someone she had been before, someone she couldn't quite place. The hair on the back of her neck stood up and her skin prickled with dread. The air grew colder, and the peace of the place seemed to warp, twisting into something darker, more sinister. You can never escape, the voice whispered again now, more insistent, as if it were drawing closer, growing louder with each passing second. You belong to the house, Kathy. You always will. The warmth of the light around her began to flicker, its soft glow dimming, replaced by an icy chill creeping into her bones. She looked around, but there was no one there. Nothing but the empty expanse of the field. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. She had escaped. The house, the darkness, it was all behind her. This was freedom. But was it? As the whispers grew louder, Kathy began to feel the familiar pressure in her chest again, the suffocating sensation of something crawling inside her, pulling at her, trying to drag her back. She could feel it, the house beneath her skin, in the very air around her. It was here. It was in this place, the field, the light, the soft breeze. It all started to feel wrong. The grass beneath her feet became darker, its color shifting to a sickly brown, as if it were decaying. The trees around her began to bend and twist their branches, reaching out like skeletal fingers, and the sky above darkened the colors of twilight, fading into a deep, oppressive black. Kathy's pulse quickened as the whispers grew louder, the voices of the house filling her mind again, suffocating her with their demands. Come back, Kathy. She turned around quickly, her heart thumping in her chest. There in the distance was the door again. The door that had first appeared to her, just a crack of light in the midst of the shadows beckoning her. It was standing open, waiting, calling to her. The figure of George was there, standing just beyond the door, his face twisted in that same unnatural grin. Behind him, the house loomed dark and empty, its presence so heavy that it seemed to distort the very air around it. The house was pulling her back, reeling her in with its insidious call. No. Kathy whispered, her breath caught in her throat. She turned away, her feet stumbling as she backed away from the door, away from the figure. I won't go back. I can't. But the shadows were already closing in on her again. the whispers getting louder, more desperate, as if they were urging her to come back, urging her to accept what she had become. She could feel the weight of it, the house pressing down on her, its tendrils creeping into her thoughts. There was nowhere left to run. She wasn't free, not yet, but she wasn't ready to give up. With everything she had left, Kathy ran toward the light. She ran toward the door, toward the thing that had always been there, always waiting for her. But this time when she reached it, she wasn't running from it. She wasn't escaping. This time she would face it, and she would fight. Kathy's legs burned with the effort, her body protesting with every step as she ran toward the door, the light growing ever so slightly brighter with each desperate stride. Her chest felt tight, the weight of the house's presence still clinging to her, pulling at her from all sides. But this time, there was something different. This time, she was not running to escape. This time, she was running towards something, a confrontation she knew she couldn't avoid. The whispers were deafening now, a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, their words blending together in a frantic chorus. "You can't fight us, Kathy. You belong to the darkness. You are ours." The words twisted in her mind, pulling at her thoughts, digging deeper with each passing moment. They were the house's words, the words of the entity that had consumed everything she loved. But she was no longer listening to them. She couldn't afford to. Her heart pounded in her ears, and her breath came in ragged gasps. The light ahead grew brighter, warmer, as if it were reaching out to her, calling her to step into it. For a brief moment, she thought she could feel the warmth of it on her skin, like a promise of something better, something beyond the suffocating darkness. The figure of George, the twisted reflection of him, still stood just behind the door, a shadow that flickered in the edges of her vision. His eyes glowed with that sickly red light, a hollow stare that seemed to pierce through her very soul. The grin on his face stretched wider, too wide, too unnatural. The house had taken him just as it had taken Missy. But Kathy wasn't going to let it take her too. Not again. She reached out her hand, trembling, as she grasped the handle of the door. The cold metal burned against her palm, sending a shock of fear through her. But she didn't stop. She yanked the door open with all her strength, stepping through it into the light, into whatever waited for her beyond. And for a moment, everything was still. The air was different now. It was warmer, but not oppressive. The light was soft, not blinding, but full of promise. There was a hum of life in the air, a gentle vibration like the pulse of something alive. She was no longer in the field, no longer in the forest. She was standing in a place that felt real, but not entirely familiar. It was safe. Kathy stood still for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to calm her racing heart. The door behind her slammed shut, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she felt the weight of the house lift from her shoulders. The air didn't feel heavy anymore. It didn't feel like it was pressing against her, suffocating her, pulling her back into its depths. The whispers, the darkness, they were gone. At least for now. She took a step forward, looking around. The landscape was like nothing she had ever seen before. It was a strange place, yet somehow familiar, like a dream she couldn't quite remember. The sky was a soft shade of violet, dotted with stars that didn't twinkle but pulsed gently, as if they were breathing. The ground beneath her feet was soft like moss, but warm. And ahead in the distance, there was a structure. Something ancient, something old and grand, standing in the middle of this ethereal world. Her mind raced with questions. Where was she? Had she truly escaped? Was this another trick of the house? Or was this real? She took another step, then another. moving toward the structure in the distance. It looked like a building of stone, its architecture unlike anything she had ever seen. Tall, sweeping arches, intricate carvings, and columns that reached toward the sky. There was a strange sense of calm in the air, an odd serenity, but the gnawing feeling in the back of her mind didn't go away. She couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong, that this place too might not be real. The closer she got to the building, the more she could feel its presence, an energy that felt ancient, powerful, and somehow comforting. It wasn't the oppressive force of the house, but something different, something protective. When she reached the entrance, the massive stone doors opened on their own, as if they had been waiting for her. She stepped through her eyes, adjusting to the soft glow of light that illuminated the interior. The walls were adorned with tapestries depicting scenes of battles and heroes, the figures frozen in time. The air was still, but there was a hum, a subtle vibration that seemed to echo through the stone. In the center of the room stood an altar, ancient and worn but still imposing. The space around it was vast, filled with an energy that made her feel both small and powerful, as if she were standing at the threshold of something immense. Kathy stepped closer, drawn to the altar, though her feet felt heavy, as if the weight of her journey had caught up with her. And then she saw it. On the altar was a small, unassuming object, a stone smooth and cold to the touch. It was dark, almost black, with veins of crimson running through it, like it had been forged from the very essence of darkness. But there was something in it, something familiar, something she could not ignore. Her hand trembled as she reached out to touch it, her fingers grazing the surface of the stone. The moment she made contact, a flood of images and sensations washed over her memories that weren't hers. Memories of the house of the darkness that had consumed everything. She saw faces people she didn't recognize, but somehow she knew them. They had all been here in this place, drawn to it, just as she had been. They too had come from the house seeking something, searching for an escape. Kathy pulled her hand away, her heart racing as she stumbled backward. The images in her mind were still swirling a storm of forgotten memories and lost souls, but they were fading now. The stone pulsed gently in her hand, and the light around her dimmed as though the very air was responding to her touch. The voice came again, soft and insistent. "You belong here now, Kathy." She didn't want to believe it. She couldn't. But as the words echoed through her mind, the truth settled in. The house had never truly been defeated. It had merely changed form. This place, this ancient structure, was part of the same curse. And she was part of it now too. Kathy's mind spun with the weight of the realization. The house wasn't just a place. It was something older, something far deeper than she had ever understood. She had been running from it, fighting it for so long, but now, standing before the altar, in this strange, ethereal place, she understood the truth. The house was more than a building. It was a force, a presence that existed beyond the physical, beyond space and time. It had always been there, lurking in the corners of her mind, waiting for her to acknowledge it. The stone pulsed again, its crimson veins shimmering in the dim light of the room. Kathy stepped back from the altar, her breath shallow, her body cold with fear. She had thought she had escaped. She had thought she had outrun it. But now she knew there was no escaping it. The house had become part of her, and wherever she went, it would follow. She closed her eyes, trying to gather her thoughts, trying to push away the overwhelming sense of doom that had settled in her chest. There had to be a way out. There had to be something she could do to break free from this. But the stone, the presence in the room, was telling her otherwise. It was speaking to her, calling to her, pulling her into its dark embrace. "You belong here, Kathy." The voice whispered again, soft but insistent, echoing through her mind. "You always have." Kathy's hands clenched into fists at her sides, her nails digging into her palms. She wasn't going to give in. She wasn't going to let the house take her like it had taken her family. She had already lost so much, but she refused to lose herself. The stone on the altar seemed to draw her in its pulse, rhythmic, hypnotic, as though it were calling her to come closer. She could feel it in her chest, in her bones. The pull was undeniable. She could hear the whispers again, swirling around her, louder this time, pressing against her mind. But she fought it. She fought against the house's influence with every ounce of strength she had left. "You are not me," Kathy muttered under her breath, her voice breaking through the suffocating whispers. "I am not part of you." She stepped forward, her hands trembling as they reached for the stone. This time, she didn't pull away. She touched it again, feeling its cold surface under her fingertips. For a moment, nothing happened. But then the stone grew warm in her hand, and the pulsing grew more intense, the red veins flickering like a heartbeat. Her body jolted as the vision hit her. The walls of the room seemed to dissolve around her. And for a brief, terrible moment, Kathy was back in the house. The walls were crumbling, the air thick with rot and decay. The shadows stretched out like claws, reaching for her. And there in the center of the room were the figures of her family. Missy, George, twisted, broken, their eyes vacant and empty. They were standing in the shadows, waiting for her to join them. Kathy's breath caught in her throat, her heart slamming against her ribcage. "No," she whispered. "No, I can't go back." But the figures reached out to her, their arms outstretched, their faces contorted in twisted grins. "Come back," they whispered in unison. "Come home, Kathy. You belong here. We belong here." Kathy closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She could feel the weight of their presence, the pull of the house trying to drag her back into its suffocating darkness. She couldn't let it happen. She couldn't. She pulled her hand away from the stone, the vision shattering into pieces as the room returned to its normal form. The shadows were still there, lingering in the corners of the room, but the figures of her family were gone. The air was still thick with the weight of the house, but Kathy wasn't done. She wouldn't be. "I am not yours," Kathy said, her voice stronger now, more certain. She raised her hand, staring at the stone on the altar. The house was in her, yes, but it didn't own her. She wouldn't let it. The stone pulsed again, but this time, Kathy could feel the energy around her shifting. The room was no longer just a place of dread. It was something more, a crossroads between two worlds, between light and dark. And she was the one standing at the center, the one who could choose. "I'm not giving in," Kathy whispered, her voice firm, steady. The stone began to crack. The sound was soft at first, a small fracture running through the dark surface. But then it deepened, spreading across the stone, splintering it into shards. Kathy stepped back as the stone began to crumble, the light from within it pulsing wildly, erratically. The energy in the room grew chaotic, swirling around her like a storm. The shadows in the corners of the room began to writhe as if they were alive. But Kathy stood her ground. The crackling grew louder, more violent, and suddenly the stone shattered completely, its fragments scattering across the altar. The light that had been contained within it burst out, flooding the room with blinding brilliance. For a moment, Kathy couldn't see. The light was overwhelming, disorienting. But then, as the light dimmed, she felt something. It was a shift, a release. The house's grip on her seemed to loosen like a chain being broken. The suffocating presence that had been weighing on her was finally starting to fade. But even as the shadows began to recede, Kathy knew the truth. The house had never truly left her. It never could. But she had won, for now. And as the last of the light from the shattered stone faded, Kathy took a deep breath, a sense of relief flooding through her body. The house was still there, lurking somewhere in the dark, waiting for her to slip. But she had just taken a step toward freedom, and she wouldn't stop fighting. The light that had flooded the room began to fade, leaving Kathy standing in the middle of the stone chamber, heart-racing chest heaving with every shallow breath she took. The remnants of the broken stone lay scattered across the altar, their jagged edges catching the faint glow of what little light remained. But the oppressive presence, the suffocating weight of the house was now gone. At least for the moment. She could feel it, though the absence. It wasn't relief exactly, more like a void that had been temporarily filled. The shadows had receded, but they were still there, lurking just beyond the edges of her vision, waiting for the moment of weakness, of fatigue. She was never fully free, not until the house was completely destroyed, and even then she wasn't sure it could ever truly be eradicated. But this moment, this was hers. Kathy took a slow, steadying breath, trying to ground herself in the present, to shake the residual panic that clung to her like the scent of smoke. She felt a strange mixture of triumph and uncertainty. She had fought the house's grip, at least for now, and won. But she knew the house was clever. It had always been clever. It would find another way to pull her back into its endless cycle of suffering. As she took another step toward the altar, the room seemed to shift slightly. The walls, once rigid and unmoving, now seemed fluid, as though they were bending, stretching, responding to her presence. The feeling wasn't foreign to her. She had felt it in the house before. The room was alive, just like the house. Kathy clenched her fists, pushing away the creeping fear. She had come too far to let the house swallow her again. She had faced its darkness, its horrors, and she had survived. She wouldn't let it take her again. Not now. Not ever. But as the last remnants of the light disappeared and the room returned to its previous muted state, something else stirred. Something far darker. A low hum filled the air, the kind of vibration that seemed to come from deep within the stone walls. Kathy's heart skipped a beat as she realized the hum was not just an ambient sound. It was coming from within her too. Her mind, her very soul, was resonating with the space around her. She spun toward the far end of the room, the shadows now stretching long as if they were reaching for her. The temperature in the room dropped sharply, the air becoming thick with the scent of decay. Her breath fogged in front of her and her pulse quickened. There was something in the room, something that had been hidden until now, something the house had kept from her. The whispers started again, this time more urgent. They echoed through her mind louder than before, as if they were all around her. You can't hide from us, Kathy. We are always watching. You are ours. Kathy's body went cold, as the whispers seemed to swirl around her, closing in on her every movement. She couldn't hear the voice of the house anymore. It had turned into something more primal, more visceral. The voices weren't just a product of the house. They were inside her. They were her fears, her doubts, her own broken memories, all distorted into a symphony of anguish. She stepped back, trying to shake off the mounting pressure. The shadows that clung to the room seemed to stretch toward her, pulling her into the darkness. The altar, the shattered stone. Everything began to distort, warping in time, with the deep hum that filled the room. And then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it, a figure faint at first, but growing clearer with each passing second. It was her. No, it wasn't her. It was an echo, a shadow of herself. Her doppelganger stepped forward, its eyes glowing the same unnatural red, its smile wide, and filled with the same emptiness she had seen on Missy's face. The figure was wearing her clothes, standing as she stood moving like her, but there was something wrong about it. The light in its eyes wasn't human. It was the light of the house, its malevolent presence alive and watching. The reflection wasn't just an image. It was a fragment of the house. You cannot escape me. The shadow whispered, its voice soft, but its words a stark reminder of the truth. You are me. We are the same. Kathy's blood ran cold. Her shadow moved closer, its steps deliberate, controlled. It was her, but not her. It was everything the house had twisted, everything it had broken, condensed into a single form. It was the final reflection of everything she had become in the house, broken, twisted, a puppet, a vessel. I'm not you, Kathy, whispered the words, barely escaping her lips. Her legs were trembling beneath her, the weight of the room pushing down on her chest. But she didn't back down. This was her moment. This was her fight. The shadow tilted its head, its smile widening. "Oh, but you are..." It purred, the voice dripping with malice. "You were always part of me." Kathy's breath quickened as the shadow lunged, its form dissipating into the air like smoke. For a split second, she thought it was gone. But then the pressure in the room increased, the air becoming dense with the weight of its presence. She could feel the shadow inside her mind now, its influence seeping into her thoughts, her memories. The figure wasn't just a reflection. It was a manifestation of everything she had endured, her pain, her suffering, her darkest fears. It was the house made flesh, standing in front of her. Kathy took a step back, her mind racing for an answer, for something, anything that would help her defeat the shadow. She couldn't fight it with strength. She couldn't fight it physically. But there was one thing she could do. She could fight it with her will. Closing her eyes, Kathy took a deep breath, drawing on every ounce of strength she had left. She focused on the one thing that the house could never take from her, her own humanity. The love she still had for her family, the resilience that had kept her going all this time. The house had tried to consume her, to break her, but it hadn't succeeded. When she opened her eyes, the shadow was gone, but something had shifted in the room. The air felt lighter now, less oppressive, though still thick with the remnants of the battle. The walls were no longer closing in on her. She wasn't trapped, for now Kathy had won, but she knew deep in her heart that the house would never truly let go. It was a part of her now, and though she had broken its hold on her for the moment, it would always find a way back. She had to be ready. Kathy took a step forward, her eyes scanning the room one last time. The light from the shattered stone pulsed faintly behind her, a reminder of what she had fought for. And in the distance, she could see it, a doorway, a new exit, a new path. The house had pulled her into its web, but she had found a way out, and for now that was enough. Kathy's heart beat in her chest like a drum, her pulse pounding as she stared at the doorway in the distance. The light from the shattered stone behind her pulsed gently, a faint reminder of the force that had tried to pull her under. But now, there was something different about this exit. It wasn't the door she had first encountered, the one that had seemed like a beacon of hope, only to be swallowed by shadows. No. This door was real solid, and it beckoned her forward, like a final escape from everything she had suffered. But Kathy knew deep down that the house, the force that had twisted everything she knew, was still watching. Even though the shadow had dissipated, the air still felt heavy, charged with something dark and ancient. The house had always been clever, always patient. She wasn't fooling herself. This door might lead her away, but it didn't mean the battle was over. Taking a steadying breath, Kathy forced her legs to move. Every step felt heavy, as though the ground beneath her was unwilling to let her go. But she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to. The house had claimed her family. It had claimed her soul once, and it would do it again if she gave it the chance. She reached the door, her hand trembling as it hovered just above the handle. The house was still there, lingering in the corners of her mind. The shadows were never far, always just beneath the surface of her thoughts, ready to return when she wasn't looking. But Kathy wasn't going to let it happen. Not this time. With one last breath, she gripped the handle and turned it. The door opened slowly, the sound of hinges creaking in the stillness. Kathy's stomach churned, uncertainty rising like a tidal wave. The world on the other side wasn't what she expected. It wasn't some grand, illuminated escape. It wasn't a perfect world or a dream that promised peace. Instead, she was faced with a vast, desolate landscape. There was no sun, no stars, only an endless void stretching out before her. The ground beneath her feet was cracked dry like a desert of forgotten dreams. The air was cold, and the silence was deafening. There was nothing but an overwhelming sense of isolation, of emptiness. Her heart skipped a beat. Was this the afterlife? Was this where she had truly ended up after all this suffering, this fight? Had the house finally consumed her, pulled her into its deepest corner where no one could escape? Is this it? She whispered to herself, the words barely audible in the vast silence. She took a tentative step forward, her footsteps echoing through the desolate landscape. There was no direction here, no clear path, no goal to strive for. Only the endless expanse before her. She was alone, utterly and completely alone. But as she moved forward, something changed. In the distance, just beyond the horizon, a faint glow began to appear. It was distant at first, but it grew brighter with each passing moment, like the first sliver of light at dawn. Her eyes widened. Was it another doorway? A way out? Or was it something more? As she took another step, the ground beneath her feet trembled. A low rumble vibrated through the air, and she felt the hair on the back of her neck stand up. The sense of dread that had settled in her chest surged again. It was too quiet, too still. And yet, in the distance, the glow grew stronger, almost as if calling to her, urging her to come closer. Kathy's breath quickened as the rumble intensified. It was coming from below, from deep within the earth itself. The land trembled, and with it, Kathy's sense of security shattered. The world around her began to warp, to twist, as the ground cracked and split open in front of her. The glow that had once been welcoming now seemed to pulse with a dark energy flickering like a dying flame. The whispers returned louder this time, more insistent. You cannot escape. You are here forever. The words were familiar now, the sound of the house, of the presence that had claimed her and her family. They echoed in her mind like a haunting song, pulling at her, drawing her closer to the dark glow. But Kathy didn't stop. She couldn't. She had fought too hard to give in now. She had been through hell to get here. She had lost everything, and though she might not understand what awaited her on the other side of this glowing light, she knew she could never go back to the house. To the shadows, she took a deep breath, and with renewed strength she ran toward the light. It grew brighter as she neared its intensity, blinding her, but she didn't flinch. She didn't stop. This was her chance. She had to take it. But as she reached the light, something happened. The air around her seemed to freeze, and for the first time, Kathy felt a coldness that was unlike anything she had experienced before. It wasn't the chilling cold of the house. It was colder, deeper, more personal. It wasn't just the world around her freezing. It was her. The warmth in her body, the very essence of life, was being pulled from her. The glow before her flickered violently, its light flashing like a beacon pulling her toward it. But at the same time, It was consuming her. She could feel her body weakening, her muscles turning to stone, as if the light itself were draining her strength, her will to continue. Her heart faltered. The house hadn't just been a physical space. It had been a force, and this was its final form. A prison. A world where she would never truly escape. The light was the house. The house had always been more than a building. It was everywhere, even in this strange, otherworldly place. The door had been a trap, a thin thread of hope woven into the fabric of her own mind. Kathy stopped in her tracks, her hands shaking, her body trembling. The light that had once seemed like salvation now felt like a lie. She had been running from it all this time, only to find that there was no escape. And yet, there was still a flicker of defiance deep inside her. The house might have claimed her mind, but it had never truly claimed her will. "No," she whispered, her voice ragged but strong. "Not again." Kathy turned her legs unsteady beneath her and faced the darkness behind her. She knew there was no easy way out. There never had been. The house had followed her into this place, and it would follow her again and again, no matter where she went. But this time, she wouldn't let it consume her. Not now. Not ever again. She faced the light and whispered, "You don't own me," and she walked toward the darkness. The moment Kathy turned away from the blinding light, the air shifted. The ground beneath her feet trembled slightly, as if the very space she stood in was holding its breath. She had taken a step into the unknown, into the vast, empty void, and yet something in her heart felt right, felt grounded. The darkness ahead of her wasn't like the suffocating blackness of the house. No, this was different. This was freedom, freedom to face whatever came next, without being dragged back into the grip of the house's oppressive will. Her heart beat steadily now, as though her pulse was no longer under the control of the shadows that had once wrapped around her. The whispers from the house, faint and distant, now still gnawed at her mind, but she wasn't listening. She couldn't afford to. The only thing that mattered now was her will to move forward. One step, then another. Each step felt heavier, but at the same time more liberating. She was choosing this path, and that made all the difference. As Kathy walked through the darkness, the feeling of being watched, of the house's ever-present gaze, began to fade. The shadows around her, which had once seemed to stretch with malevolent intent, began to lose their power. The grip of the house's influence loosened with each step, as though the very act of defying it was weakening its hold. Then, just as the stillness around her began to feel like the first breath of freedom, she heard it, a soft, rustling sound like a whisper carried on the wind. It was distant at first, but it was getting closer. The familiar presence, the figure that had haunted her throughout this journey. It was back. The force, the house, whatever it was still here. Kathy's heart began to pound once again, and she instinctively reached for her side, her hands trembling. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't have any defense, but she had something more powerful. She had her own strength, her own resolve, and she had nothing left to lose. The sound grew louder footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the silence. Kathy spun on her heel, her eyes darting through the murk of the darkness, trying to find the source of the sound. It was getting closer, and her breath caught in her throat as she realized she wasn't alone anymore. A figure emerged from the shadows. Kathy's heart nearly stopped in her chest as the figure stepped forward, the contours of its form becoming clearer in the dim light. It was a man, tall and imposing, with long dark hair that cascaded down his back like a cloak of shadows. His eyes, glowing an eerie red, seemed to pierce through her, as though he could see every fear, every insecurity buried deep within her. The figure was familiar. George. But it wasn't George. It was something far worse, something the house had turned him into. a hollow shell of the man she once loved. His face distorted by an unnatural twisted grin, his body languid and unnervingly still. The emptiness in his eyes seemed to reach into her very soul. "No," Kathy whispered, stepping back. "You're not him. You're not George." But the figure didn't answer. Instead, it stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as though every motion was measured, calculated. There was no warmth in the way it moved, no trace of the man she had known. The house had drained that from him, just as it had drained her, just as it had drained everything else. The house was a parasite, consuming life, consuming hope, consuming love, and now it was consuming her. "You can't outrun it, Kathy." The figure whispered its voice, a low rasp that sent chills down her spine. "You're already part of it." Kathy shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. "No, I'm not. I'm not part of you. I won't be." But the figure kept coming, its eyes burning with the crimson light, its grin widening in that same hollow, unsettling way. "You already are, Kathy. You always will be." She could feel the pull of it. The pull of the house drawing her in inch by inch, second by second. The whispers in her mind grew louder, more insistent. "You belong to us. You can never escape." Kathy closed her eyes, shutting out the figure, the whispers, the darkness closing in around her. She could still feel the weight of the house's influence pressing against her, but this time she wouldn't give in. She refused to. She reached deep inside, grasping the last flicker of defiance that had kept her alive this far. With every ounce of strength she had left, she pushed back against the darkness, against the figure that had once been George. "I am not yours," she whispered through clenched teeth. "I am not part of this place. You will not take me." And in that moment, something within her snapped. The pull of the house weakened the weight of its influence, lifting from her chest. The figure of George faltered its form, flickering, distorting like a mirage, and for a brief moment, Kathy saw the man she had once known, the man who had loved her, standing in the shadows, waiting to be freed. But it was fleeting. The figure dissolved into the darkness, vanishing without a trace. Kathy stood still, her body trembling, her breath shallow. The whispers, the darkness, the weight, they were all gone. She was alone now. The house no longer had its hold on her. She had won. Kathy turned away from the spot where the figure had stood, her heart pounding in her chest as the quiet of the night surrounded her once more. The darkness still lingered, but it no longer felt suffocating. The house had lost. At least for now, she was free. But even as she took a step forward, she couldn't shake the feeling that the fight wasn't over. The house might have been banished for the moment, but its mark was on her. It was in her mind, in her soul. The house would always be a part of her, even if she never stepped foot in it again. For now, though, Kathy would keep moving. She would keep fighting, one step at a time. Kathy's heart still raced as she took cautious steps away from the place where George's twisted figure had disappeared. She had survived again. She had pushed back against the suffocating grip of the house, fought off its dark influence, but even now she could feel the weight of its presence lingering heavy in the air. It wasn't gone. Not really. As she moved forward, each step felt like a victory, yet a quiet dread settled deep in her chest. She had escaped the house's grasp once, but had she truly? The whispers, the endless pull. It all felt as though the house had merely paused, waiting, watching for a moment of weakness. The ground beneath her was soft like a forest floor, but there was no greenery, no life here, only an endless stretch of barren land. The moon hung high above, casting pale light over the surroundings, but there were no stars, no warmth. It was as if she had stepped into a space where time and life no longer existed. She felt exposed here, vulnerable, in the way you feel when you stand on the edge of a great cliff, knowing that the fall is inevitable, but unsure when it will come. The air around her was unnaturally still, as though the very fabric of reality had been warped. Her own footsteps echoed too loudly, too sharply, as if this place had no meaning or direction, only silence. "Where am I?" Kathy muttered, her voice breaking the stillness as she spoke aloud. She felt ridiculous asking, but she needed to hear herself to ground herself. This place had no answers. It wasn't an escape. It was an endless expanse of emptiness. And yet she continued to move forward. Her legs were sore, her body bruised from the struggles she had endured. Her mind was heavy with exhaustion, but she couldn't stop. Not now. She had already made it this far. But where was she going? She had fought her way through the house's halls, escaped its clutches. But to what end? What was waiting for her here? In this strange, empty place. The wind stirred in the distance, and for a fleeting moment Kathy thought she saw something. Someone moving through the shadows. A figure. A silhouette. Her breath hitched. The figure seemed to emerge from nowhere. Yet it was walking toward her with the same deliberate pace she had come to recognize, the same slow, methodical steps that had always preceded some new horror. Her heart skipped a beat as she stood frozen, unsure whether she should move toward the figure or flee. But there was no time to choose. The figure was closer now, and Kathy could see it clearly. It wasn't a person, not really. It was a shadow, its edges flickering like the dying light of a candle, and it seemed to shift with every blink. A specter, it stopped just a few feet in front of her, and Kathy instinctively took a step back, though her legs felt as if they were made of stone. Her pulse hammered in her ears as she looked into the featureless form of the shadow. The air around her seemed to freeze, and the very ground beneath her feet seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. Then a voice broke the silence. "You can't outrun it, Kathy." It was a voice she recognized, but it wasn't one she wanted to hear. It was George's voice, but twisted, broken, as though it had been shaped by something far darker than the man she had once loved. The figure stepped forward, its presence seeming to devour the light around it. Kathy felt the familiar weight of dread settle deep in her chest. She knew what this was. She had been here before. This wasn't just another manifestation. This was the house. It was still inside her. The shadow seemed to pull closer, its form flickering like smoke. The whispers returned louder, now insistent. "You are part of it now," they hissed in unison. "You will never escape." Kathy's breath caught in her throat as the shadow reached out toward her. The very space around her seemed to warp the ground beneath her feet, shifting like quicksand. The darkness curled around her, pulling at her limbs, trying to pull her back into its suffocating depths. "No." Kathy gasped, her voice strained with panic. She tried to pull away, but the shadow's influence was too strong. It gripped her like cold steel, its presence wrapping around her body, its touch sending a jolt of ice through her veins. She tried to fight it, tried to break free, but her body was slow to respond, like it was fighting against her. The whispers were growing louder, the voices of the house crawling under her skin, gnawing at her mind. She could feel herself slipping, could feel herself starting to lose herself in the dark presence once more. But then something shifted. In the depths of her fear, in the heart of the suffocating darkness, Kathy felt a flicker of the same defiance that had brought her this far. She wasn't going to give in. Not again. She had come too far. Too much had been lost already. She couldn't let it all be in vain. Her mind sharpened. She focused on the one thing that had kept her alive all this time, the love she had once shared with her family. George, Missy. She would not let them remain trapped, twisted, and lost. She would not let the house win. With a fierce cry, Kathy pushed against the shadow with all the strength she could muster, forcing herself to step back to break free. The figure resisted its grip tightening, but Kathy fought with everything in her. She would not be consumed. She would not return to the house. And in that moment of desperate, raw defiance, the shadow recoiled. The darkness around her seemed to pull back, dissipating like smoke in the wind. The cold, suffocating grip of the house loosened. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kathy could breathe. She could move. The figure flickered, then dissolved, fading into nothing. Kathy stood still, gasping for breath, her body shaking from the effort. But she was free. The darkness had been repelled for now, but she knew deep down that this was far from over. The house had left its mark on her. She could feel it. It would always be with her. But Kathy had learned something in this fight, something that gave her strength. She had the power to defy it. And that was the key. That was her only hope. She stepped forward, her path uncertain. But one thing was clear. She would keep moving. She would keep fighting no matter what lay ahead. The house wasn't done with her. But Kathy wasn't done with it either. Kathy's steps were slow but deliberate as she moved forward. The dark void that had once felt like an endless, suffocating expanse now seemed less oppressive, though the weight of the house's lingering presence still hovered just beneath the surface. Each breath she took felt heavier than the last, and the shadows seemed to reach out from the corners of her vision, as if reminding her that even in this strange, empty world, she was never truly alone. But she didn't stop. The crackling of the ground beneath her feet, the faint hum of energy in the air. Everything in this place felt both alive and dead, as though it existed on the edge of reality, a place trapped between the living world and whatever lay beyond. Kathy's body ached, her legs growing weary with each step, but she kept moving her will, pushing her forward. Her mind was racing, thoughts tumbling over one another like a storm she couldn't control. Was this a new realm? Had she escaped into a new nightmare? But there was something else, a tiny spark of clarity in the chaos. She knew one thing for certain. She was stronger than the house's pull. She had already fought its grip once. She could do it again. Her gaze was fixed ahead, though the path was uncertain, the land stretching out before her like an unmarked wasteland. There was no guide, no direction, no sign of civilization. Just empty space and the eerie quiet that still hung heavy in the air. Then, just as she began to feel the first stirrings of doubt, she saw it. A flicker in the distance, a glimmer of light. Her heart skipped a beat. Was it real? She had been here before, standing before false hope. But this time, the light felt different. It wasn't the blinding, suffocating kind. It was soft, subtle, like the promise of something that had been waiting for her, something she could reach. She didn't hesitate. The path to the light was faint, almost imperceptible, like the flickering of a distant star against an endless night sky. But it called to her louder than anything the house had ever whispered. It beckoned her forward, urging her to step closer. As she walked toward it, her mind still filled with the whispers of the house trying to pull her back, to drag her into the darkness. Once again, Kathy fought against it. Every step felt like a battle, each stride pushing back against the weight of her fears, her doubts. She had to get there. She had to reach the light. With each step, the darkness began to recede slowly but steadily. The shadows that had once seemed so suffocating now felt less alive, less eager to consume her. The light grew brighter, clearer, until Kathy could see its shape, a doorway. A real door this time, not a trap, not a trick, She reached out toward it, her breath catching in her throat as the door swung open, revealing a path bathed in soft golden light. The air around her felt fresher, the energy different. The oppressive weight of the house's influence had all but disappeared, replaced by a sense of peace that she hadn't felt in years. But just before she stepped through the threshold, a voice stopped her. Kathy. Her heart stuttered in her chest. The voice was familiar but cold. It was her name, but spoken with the same twisted malice she had heard so many times before. She turned, heart hammering in her chest, and saw the figure again, the twisted form of George, his red eyes burning with an unnatural intensity. His grin was wider now, impossibly wide, stretching across his face like a rictus of agony. But it wasn't George. Not anymore. It was the house. It had taken him completely. "You can't escape it," whispered its voice, dripping with venom. "You will always be mine." Kathy's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't stop. She had to keep moving. The light was right there. This was her chance to escape, to be free. The house had consumed her once, but it wouldn't again. Not now. With trembling hands, she stepped forward the doorway, now only inches away. The figure of George. No, the house didn't move. It stood still, its eyes fixed on her. But it couldn't stop her now. Just as her hand brushed the edge of the doorframe, the figure lunged. The darkness surged forward, wrapping around her body like a vice, pulling her back toward the shadows. The pressure was unbearable, the suffocating weight of the house closing in once more. Kathy gasped for air, struggling against the force, but she didn't stop. She wouldn't stop. With a final desperate cry, she slammed her hand against the door, pushing against the house's pull, fighting with everything she had left. The door creaked open wider, the light spilling out in a flood, pushing back the darkness. And then, with one final push, Kathy stepped through. She was free. Kathy collapsed onto the ground the moment the door closed behind her, her body shaking with exhaustion and the weight of everything she had just fought against. The light from the door slowly faded, but the air in this new space felt different, clean, untouched, as though it was a place that existed beyond the reach of the house, beyond the dark grip of its influence. She was no longer in the oppressive realm she had left behind. She looked around, her breath, ragged, her heart still pounding as the adrenaline slowly began to subside. The ground beneath her was soft grass beneath her fingers, and the sky above was impossibly clear, an endless expanse of pale blue. The warmth of the sun on her face was comforting, a sharp contrast to the cold darkness she had just fled. The whispering voices had stopped. The shadows that had plagued her every step had finally disappeared. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Kathy allowed herself to rest. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, inhaling the clean air that filled her lungs, feeling the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. The fight, the terror, the unrelenting pull of the house, it was over. She was out, but even in the quiet of this place, even as peace settled around her like a warm blanket, there was still something she couldn't shake. She had escaped, yes. But had she truly? The house had never truly let go of her, and there was a part of her that feared it. Never would. Kathy forced herself to sit up, shaking her head as she tried to push those thoughts away. She wasn't going to let the house define her. She had fought for her life. She had fought for her family. She had come this far, and she wasn't going to let fear pull her back into the shadows. With steady hands, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs weak but steady. The landscape around her seemed untouched by the darkness she had just fled, a peaceful meadow with flowers blooming in every color of the rainbow. The distant mountains loomed on the horizon, their peaks soft in the distance, promising something beyond, something new. For a moment, Kathy wondered if this place was real, if it was just another illusion created by the house to trap her once again. But the sunlight was warm on her skin, the breeze gentle and alive, and she knew deep in her heart that this was different. This was real. She had fought her way here, fought her way through the nightmare that had consumed her, and now she was standing on the edge of something new. The wind whispered through the trees, soft and peaceful. Kathy glanced over at the open field and noticed something odd. There, standing just beyond the line of trees, was a figure. She stiffened, her pulse quickening. Was it another trick of the house? Had it followed her here into this place of light? But as she focused on the figure, it became clearer. It wasn't the shadow of the house. It wasn't the twisted figure of George, or the malevolent force she had come to know so well. No, this figure was different. It was a woman, standing tall and graceful, her form illuminated by the golden light that poured over the meadow. Her face was soft, serene and familiar. Kathy knew her. "Mom?" The figure said, her voice calm and gentle, as though it were carried by the wind itself. Kathy blinked, her heart aching in her chest. It was her mother, her real mother, the woman she had loved and lost, who had been swallowed up by time and pain long ago. And now here she was, standing before Kathy in this beautiful, peaceful place, her presence radiating warmth and comfort. "Mom," Kathy whispered, her voice breaking. Tears welled up in her eyes as she took a tentative step forward, not believing what she was seeing. Her mother smiled, the kind of smile Kathy had remembered from her childhood, the smile that spoke of unconditional love, the smile that made her feel safe no matter the storm around her. It was real. She was real. "You did it," her mother said softly, her voice like the sound of a lullaby, soothing and tender. "You fought the darkness. You fought for yourself." Kathy's hands trembled as she reached out toward her mother, as if afraid this moment would vanish the instant she touched her. But her mother's arms were already outstretched, waiting for her. Kathy stepped forward slowly, unsure of what to believe. But the moment their hands met, warmth and peace flooded through her like a wave. Her mother's presence felt as real as the earth beneath her feet, as real as the sky above her head. I couldn't save them," Kathy said, her voice thick with emotion. "George, Missy, they're lost, Mom. I couldn't bring them back." Her mother's eyes softened with sorrow. "You fought for them, and you did everything you could. But sometimes not all battles are ours to win." Kathy's chest tightened at the words, the pain of her lost family rising again. "But it wasn't supposed to be like this. We were supposed to be happy to live our lives, not trapped by that house. Not like this." Her mother stepped closer, placing her hands gently on Kathy's shoulders, grounding her, anchoring her. "I know, sweetheart. I know. But there is a way forward. The past doesn't define you. The choices you make, the strength you carry within you, that's what will shape your future." The words hit Kathy like a thunderclap. The choices you make. She had always believed that she had to fight her way through the darkness, that she had to carry the weight of it alone. But her mother's words were a light in the dark, a reminder that there was more to life than just survival. There was living. There was hope. Kathy stood taller, a quiet strength building inside her. She had lost so much, but she still had herself. She still had her ability to fight, to choose. "I'm not done," she whispered to herself, her mother's comforting presence still radiating warmth from where she stood. "I'm not finished. I won't let it take me." Her mother smiled, proud and full of love. "I know, Kathy, I know. And you don't have to do it alone." Kathy's eyes shimmered with the weight of the words. She had spent so long fighting, so long struggling alone, but she didn't have to anymore. She had faced the house, had fought its pull, and she would continue to fight to find her peace, to carry the memory of her family forward, even if they couldn't return. With a final nod to her mother, Kathy stepped forward into the light, her heart steady, her spirit unbroken. She was free, and this time she would stay free. Kathy's feet moved steadily across the soft grass, each step affirming her resolve. The weight of the past, of the house, of the memories that had haunted her, slowly lifted with every stride. It wasn't an instant transformation. Peace didn't come all at once, but as she walked through the bright field, Kathy felt something more powerful than the suffocating darkness she had known. She felt alive, truly alive, for the first time in so long. The meadow stretched before her in all directions, untouched by the shadows that had once been so all-consuming. The horizon seemed endless, a place where time had no hold, where everything felt suspended between two worlds. Yet within this vast, peaceful space, Kathy didn't feel lost. She felt connected, grounded. The light from above, though gentle, filled her with a warmth she hadn't known since before the nightmare of the house had started. Behind her, her mother stood at the edge of the field, watching her with a serene expression. Kathy had come to realize in the moments they had shared together that this place wasn't the end of her journey. It was just the beginning. The wind whispered softly through the trees at the far edges of the meadow, and the scent of wild flowers filled the air. Kathy closed her eyes for a brief moment, allowing the sound of nature to fill her mind. The quiet peace here was unlike anything she had ever felt before. It was as if the world were finally breathing again. But despite the calm, a thought lingered in the back of her mind. It was a question she hadn't allowed herself to ask until now. Could she stay here forever? Could she find true peace in a world so different from the one she had fought to survive in? You don't have to decide now. Her mother's voice echoed in the stillness, as if she could hear Kathy's unspoken thoughts. You have time. You've fought long enough to earn it. Kathy turned toward her mother, the soft light casting a gentle glow over her figure. I don't know how to move forward anymore. How do I live after all that I've lost? Her voice trembled as she spoke the words, but they had to be said. The truth had been eating at her, gnawing at the edges of her thoughts. How? Her mother smiled warmly, stepping forward with an elegance that made Kathy feel like she was being drawn into a world of pure peace. You live because you choose to. Kathy's breath caught at her mother's words, the truth of them settling deeply within her. But I feel like it's all gone. Like I've lost everything that mattered. You haven't. Her mother replied softly. You carry the love with you. What you've lost doesn't define who you are. It's the choices you make now, the way you live, that will shape your future. Kathy thought about her family, about the love she had once shared with George, with Missy. The house had taken them from her, twisted them into things she could barely recognize. But now, standing in this place, with the soft light and the warmth of her mother's presence around her, Kathy understood. The house might have consumed them, but the love they shared hadn't died. It lived within her, in every step she took forward, in the choices she made. It wasn't about escaping her past. It was about moving through it, carrying the lessons, the love, and the strength it had given her. For the first time, Kathy felt the shift inside her, a sense of peace, of purpose. She had been living for so long under the weight of the house's pull, trying to outrun it. But now, she was choosing to live for herself. You'll find your way, her mother whispered, her voice full of understanding. And you'll carry them with you. Always. Kathy nodded, a lump forming in her throat, as her mother's words sank deep into her heart. It was true. Love didn't disappear with death. It didn't vanish in the face of horror. Love had shaped her, and it would continue to shape her no matter where she went, no matter what happened. Her mother's presence faded slightly, but Kathy didn't feel the sting of loss. Instead, she felt the weight of love, of memory, of everything that had been. It was all a part of her, and it would be with her forever in her heart. Turning away, Kathy looked ahead at the endless field where the horizon met the sky in a seamless line. There was a path ahead of her, stretching across the landscape, yet unmarked, just waiting to be discovered. She could feel it in the air. This was her moment to move forward, to live. The darkness was behind her now, and no matter how much the house had tried to consume her, she had won. She had taken back her strength, and as she stepped forward into the unknown, the path before her stretched out in all its possibilities. For the first time in so long, Kathy felt truly free. Kathy's feet carried her steadily forward each step, now grounded in something deeper, something far more powerful than the fears that had once haunted her. The path ahead, though still undefined, seemed to stretch out with possibility, the landscape unfolding in front of her, like an empty canvas waiting for her to paint the next chapter of her life. The field around her seemed to breathe with her, as if the land itself recognized the strength she had reclaimed. The warmth of the sun on her skin felt like an embrace, as though the world itself was welcoming her back. The stillness was alive with the subtle sounds of nature, rustling leaves, distant bird songs, the soft murmur of wind through the trees, and all of it felt peaceful, unthreatening, like a promise that things could be different now. But even as she walked, a part of Kathy couldn't fully shake the shadow of the house that still lingered in the recesses of her mind. It wasn't the same suffocating presence it had been, but it had left its mark, and Kathy knew that it would always be a part of her. The house had tried to break her, to twist her memories, to consume everything she loved. But she had fought back. She had survived, and now here in this place she was free to rebuild. With every step, the weight of her past seemed to lift. She had been carrying the trauma, the sorrow, and the fear for so long, and now, as the land around her opened up, she felt the tension in her chest ease with each passing moment. There was no running anymore. She didn't have to escape. The only thing she needed to do now was keep moving forward. Her mind drifted back to her family, George and Missy. Their faces still haunted her. Their memory, twisted by the house's influence, was forever etched into her heart. But she had been carrying their loss for so long. She had let it define her for so long. It was time to let go, to allow herself to feel the love they had given her, without the darkness that had clouded their memory. "I'll make you proud," Kathy whispered to the wind, though she didn't know if anyone could hear. The words felt like a promise, not to them, but to herself. She wouldn't let their memories be overshadowed by the house's grip. She would live. She would be more than the trauma, more than the shadow that had followed her for so long. Ahead, in the distance, the path seemed to open into a wider, brighter space, a new world waiting for her. She didn't know what was ahead, but for the first time, it didn't matter. She wasn't afraid. Suddenly, the whisper of wind changed, and the air around her shifted. The field, the horizon, everything seemed to tremble with energy, and she stopped in her tracks. Something was different now. Something familiar, but she couldn't place it. It wasn't the house, she knew that much, but the sensation was similar, a faint pull at the edge of her consciousness. Her heart stuttered in her chest. The feeling, it was like a subtle vibration in the air, a quiet hum that resonated deep within her. It felt alive, like something waiting for her to find it. She hesitated, uncertain. Was it another manifestation of the house? Was this just another layer of illusion, another trick? Kathy's breath caught in her throat as the pull intensified. The vibration grew louder, more distinct. It wasn't coming from the darkness or the house, it was coming from within her. And then she saw it, a figure. A faint shape in the distance, half formed, flickering like a shadow. It moved toward her, and her stomach clenched. For a second, she thought it might be George, or something else, something she couldn't bear to see again. But the figure wasn't the twisted form of her lost loved ones. No, this was something different, something else entirely. As it drew closer, Kathy recognized the figure. It was not a shadow, not a remnant of the past. It was a woman, tall and strong, walking toward her with a steady, determined pace. She was draped in flowing robes, her face serene, her eyes clear and calm, yet filled with an overwhelming depth of knowledge. Kathy's pulse quickened. She had seen this woman before in her dreams, in the moments when she had felt the most lost, when the house's grip had been at its strongest. This woman was not a ghost, not a manifestation of the house. She was real. This woman was a part of Kathy's own spirit, a manifestation of the strength she had carried with her all along. "Who are you?" Kathy whispered, her voice trembling as she stepped closer. The woman smiled gently, her presence radiating warmth and energy that seemed to fill the space between them. "You know who I am," the woman replied, her voice soft but commanding, as though it were a truth that Kathy had always known, but had been too afraid to recognize. Kathy's eyes widened in realization. I've been running from you. From this." The woman nodded, her eyes filled with understanding. "You were never running from me. You were running from yourself." Kathy stood still, the words hitting her like a wave. She had spent so long fighting the darkness, fighting the house, that she had never realized the truth, that the greatest battle had always been within her. She had been running from the parts of herself she thought she couldn't face. She had been running from the truth. The woman stepped forward, placing a hand on Kathy's shoulder. "You've always had the power to choose. The house was a reflection of your fear, your doubts, but you are stronger than it, stronger than you've ever realized." Tears filled Kathy's eyes, and she closed her eyes briefly, allowing the overwhelming flood of emotion to wash over her. She had fought so long to survive, to escape. But now, standing before this woman, this part of herself, she realized the truth. She hadn't just survived, she had lived. And she would continue to. The woman's smile widened and she nodded. "Your journey isn't over, Kathy. It never ends. But now you walk in your own light, and that light is stronger than any darkness the house can throw at you." Kathy looked up at the woman, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in so long. Hope. Real hope. "Thank you," she whispered. With a final knowing smile, the woman turned and began to walk away, fading into the horizon, leaving Kathy standing there, watching her go. But Kathy wasn't afraid anymore. She wasn't alone. She wasn't running. She was ready. Kathy stood alone in the meadow, but this time the solitude didn't feel oppressive. It felt like freedom. The woman, the embodiment of everything Kathy had been running from herself, was gone, but her presence lingered. It had been more than just a meeting of figures. It was a meeting of spirits, of truths. And Kathy now understood that her greatest battle had never been with the house or the darkness. It had always been within her. And in that moment, she had finally chosen to face it. She stood there, the wind brushing her hair back, the soft hum of the earth beneath her feet grounding her. And for the first time, she felt peace. Real peace. No longer was she tied to the memories of the house, the weight of loss, or the relentless pursuit of something that could never be undone. She had made her choice, and it was a choice of life, a choice to live, to continue, and to grow. As she looked around at the peaceful expanse, the sun setting on the horizon, Kathy felt something stir deep within her, a quiet promise. She could hear the faintest echo of her mother's voice in her mind, a reminder that she had always had the strength within her to carry on, to rise above. She didn't need to carry the past anymore. She could move forward, building a future from the love and resilience that remained. Kathy took a step forward and then another. Each step was lighter than the last, as if the burdens she had carried were being lifted with every stride. The path ahead was still unclear, but for the first time that uncertainty didn't scare her. She didn't need all the answers right now. She just needed to keep moving. The landscape before her seemed to beckon, and she felt an overwhelming sense of direction, of purpose. It wasn't a place she had expected to end up, but it was exactly where she was meant to be. There was still so much more to experience, so many new roads to walk down. She wasn't bound to the darkness anymore. She had broken free. Kathy's breath steadied, and with it came the quiet hum of peace, like a gentle rhythm beneath the world calling her forward. The shadows that had plagued her were no longer present, faint echoes that would always remain a part of her, but not in the way they had once been. She could still feel the house's remnants inside her, but they didn't control her anymore. They were just part of the story she carried. She was more than the house. She was more than the darkness. The sky above, now painted in deep shades of pink and orange, seemed to stretch endlessly, a canvas full of potential. She could feel it. This was her time, her life to shape. Kathy's thoughts drifted to George and Missy. She had fought for them, and she would carry their love with her. She would always honor their memory, but she knew now that their shadows would not define her. She would live, and in living, she would honor them by making choices that were hers, choices that were not weighed down by the past. She stopped walking for a moment, standing still, letting the breeze carry her thoughts into the horizon. The peace within her deepened as she realized the truth that had eluded her for so long. She had never been alone. Her love, her strength, her memories, everything she had held dear had never left her. It was all part of her, and it always would be. Her journey had been long and painful, filled with darkness and struggle, but it had also been filled with love, with the kind of love that had never died, even in the face of overwhelming loss. She had survived, and she had found her way back to herself. This was her victory. With one final steadying breath, Kathy took the last step forward, feeling the world open up before her. The road ahead might be uncertain, but she would walk it with a heart full of hope and a spirit that had been forged in the deepest of fires. And for the first time in what felt like an eternity, Kathy smiled. She had made it.